Before We Kill and Eat You by H.B. Garlock, published by Christ for the Nations, Dallas, Texas. Copyright 1974, reprinted 1979. All rights reserved, printed in the United States of America. Recorded by volunteer reader Maxine Williams.
This book is approximately 3.5 hours long. This book has audio announcements so that you can go directly to specific places in the book. There are announcements at level 1 for the title and author, the front matter, and the beginnings of the chapters.
This audiobook is the property of Tape Ministries Northwest, located in Seattle, Washington. Telephone number 206-243-7377. Permission has been granted to record this audiobook according to Copyright Law Amendment 1996, number PL 104-197. This book is exclusively for use by the blind or other persons with disabilities on loan only at no cost. Any further reproduction or distribution of this material is an infringement of this copyright amendment and is strictly prohibited. This outreach is dedicated to the service of Jesus Christ.
Forward. Few Americans in any era have known Africa as H.B. Garlock has known the continent. He is one of the last of a breed of missionaries who entered and survived by the power of the Spirit alone. What H.B. Garlock experienced in Africa could well be an additional chapter to the Acts. I have loved and respected this man through nearly half a century. I have been his guest and his listener. I have never been disappointed. His life is a walking testimony to the comfort, guidance, protection, and provision of the Holy Spirit. His mission and accomplishments stand equal to any of the continent's giants, Schweitzer, Livingstone, or Moffat. H.B. Garlock invested his life in Africa. A love for the pagan, the primitive, seemed born in him. As the years multiplied, he was able to think black. His wife and family never questioned the leading of the Lord. These experiences read like legend. He prowled the jungle before there were roads, airfields, communication, or military protection. He lived in aboriginal housing. He battled malaria. He saw others cut down almost before they had started. He faced the raw power of wickedness, cannibalism, the incantations of hell, intertribal warfare, the gloom and despair of centuries of superstition. But the repeated breakthroughs made it worthwhile. What H.B. Garlock learned the difficult way could be given to those who followed him to Africa in increasing numbers. Scores of missionaries have been able to say, "He touched my life. His counsel to me and interest in me saved me from blunders. He really introduced me to Africa." Fortunately, my great friend has been gifted with an abiding sense of humor that has been a God-used component in the heavy anointing that has always rested upon his life. You will chuckle as you read. A man like Garlock would never be content to do a mundane day's work. He is not an hireling or an institutionalist. There is the intrepid in his soul. There is that element that makes the truly great missionary. He must explore and seek to find to the uttermost. That quality has taken Garlock far beyond the comfortable and the ordinary. It has led him in paths where no line of retreat has been kept open. He has offered the challenge of Elijah. He has repeatedly placed himself in circumstances where God would have to reveal himself in authority, or he would never leave the situation alive. So you will read with amazement and appreciation. You will be proud that God has men like this author. It is a simple narrative. H.B. Garlock is a simple man. What he did for God in the gospel, he thought it his duty to do. I am glad that he has now set it forth as he remembers it, and from notes, letters, and the confirmation of others, so that this missionary saga may be added to the conquests of light. I think the lasting profit of this book will be the call to others as they read. That will multiply H.B. Garlock's investment in souls. I know he has influenced my life. C.M. Ward. Dr. Ward has been the speaker on Revival Time International Radio broadcast for 20 years. Chapter 1. God's Call to Minister. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. John 10, verse 4. My heart sank as I scanned the latest letter from home. I was at last enrolled in Beulah Heights Bible School to prepare for the ministry to which God had called me. Now, after only 2 weeks of study, came a desperate plea for help from my mother. "Henry, please come home." I was the eldest boy of 12 children, born on a farm near New Haven, Connecticut. Because of the pressing needs of such a large family, I had been taken out of school at the age of 15 to work on our own farm, and also to work for the neighbors in the community to help bring in some income. Finally, at the age of 21, I was able to leave for Bible school. I slowly reread the letter. Father and some of the other children were ill with influenza. No one left at home was able to work. Would I consider coming home to help just until Father was able to go back to work? The job I had previously held was still open for me. "Anyway, please do pray about the matter," Mother said in closing. With a heavy heart, I spent the whole night in prayer, struggling to make the right decision. In my memory, I relived the events of the previous years as I earnestly sought God hour after hour. In the early years of my childhood, my mother and brothers and sisters and I knew what it was to go hungry at times because Father had spent every cent he made for liquor. His violent temper caused much grief for all of us. We were members of a Congregational church and later a Methodist church where I went to the altar and accepted Christ at the age of 11. My mother had experienced a genuine encounter with God and greatly influenced the lives of all her children. But it was not until I was 16 years old that my father really began to serve God. At our urging, he attended a nearby Pentecostal camp meeting. There he was completely delivered from his evil habits, healed of several chronic diseases, and filled with the Holy Spirit. He came home a changed man, and the experience stayed with him until he died at the age of 88. God's hand on my life. When I saw what God had done in Father's life, I rededicated my own life to the Lord and began to fast and pray, seeking to be filled with the Holy Spirit. On Christmas Day in 1913, I was mightily filled in a deep personal experience similar to that described in Acts 2:4, and my whole life became different. Although keenly aware of my lack of education, I hoped the Lord could somehow use me in His service. My great desire was to enter Bible school, but it seemed like an impossible dream. In 1917, I visited Beulah Heights Bible School in North Bergen, New Jersey, and later that year my sister Blanche enrolled there. But since I was the eldest son, it appeared that my parents could not get along without my support. By the fall of 1918, the United States was deep into World War I, and I became eligible for the draft with an A1 classification. While expecting to be called to the Army any day, I became violently ill with influenza in an epidemic that was sweeping the country. Most of the young men in our town who had not left for military service were stricken, and many of them died within a short time. I grew steadily worse and feared I would be among those who died in the epidemic, a greater number than were killed during the war. Following is the account my father recorded of my illness. We prayed, but Henry grew worse each day until one morning he was hemorrhaging from the lungs. I realized that unless God undertook, he would die. I didn't know what to do, and wondered if I should call a doctor. I took the Bible and asked my wife where I should read. She replied, "In the place where you have opened." It was 2 Chronicles 16, verses 12 and 13, concerning King Asa. "In his disease he sought not to the Lord, but to the physicians, and Asa slept with his fathers." She said, "If we turn to the doctor now, Henry will sleep with his fathers." We did not call the doctor. About sunset, I went into the bedroom where Henry lay and saw that he did not breathe. I was filled with fear, but God gave me power to rebuke death in Jesus' name. At first, there were no apparent results. He still did not breathe. I spoke again with no visible results. The third time, as I rebuked death, he opened his eyes and saw us standing at the foot of his bed. As I travailed in prayer in my dormitory room and wept over the letter from Mother, I relived that awesome experience. I remembered sensing that I was leaving my body lying on the bed in the bedroom of our farm home. I left the house and traveled diagonally upward. I saw a golden stairway and Jesus standing at the top of it. All aches and pains were gone, and I felt as light as a feather. I felt I was going to be with the Lord. How long my spirit was gone from my body, or how far I traveled into space, I don't know. But suddenly a hand seemed to be laid upon me, and the voice of the Lord called me by name and said, "Go back. I have work for you to do. If you come now, you will come empty-handed." I want you to go to Beulah Heights Bible School to prepare for missionary work." At first I was hesitant, as I now felt so peaceful and happy and free from suffering. But again I heard the voice of the Lord speaking clearly. "Go back. If you come now, you will have no sheaves to lay at my feet. You must leave all and follow me. I want you to preach the gospel." When I said, "Yes, Lord, I'll go," immediately I descended the way I had come, down to the farm and into the bedroom where I saw my body lying on the bed. When I opened my eyes, I saw Father and Mother standing at the foot of the bed, rebuking death and the devil. There was great rejoicing when they realized their prayers had been answered. While I had wasted away and was very frail, my healing was so complete that in 3 days I was able to leave home for Bible school. I feared to put off going any longer, as the words of the Apostle Paul, "Woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel," 1 Corinthians 9:16. This verse had become a vital part of my life. I had been in Beulah Heights only a few days when the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, thus making it unnecessary to induct more young men into the Army. No turning back. My dear parents had cared for me and prayed for me during my illness. In fact, Father, whose sickness Mother was writing about, had no doubt caught the influenza from me. How could I be so ungrateful as to refuse my mother's appeal? While the tears flowed, I opened my Bible and asked God to speak to me from His Word. Immediately my eyes fell on the verse in Luke 9:62. "No man, having put his hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God." I said, "But surely, Lord, this scripture doesn't apply to me. It is merely coincidental that I happened to turn to this verse in the Bible. Please give me another scripture to guide me in the decision I should make." I opened my Bible the second time, and Matthew 10:37 stood out before me in what seemed like black, bold type. "He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." I knew God had raised me up from death's door and called me to leave all and follow Him. But my parents, whom I loved dearly, were in dire need. For me to refuse to go home now to help them would be unforgivable. On the other hand, if I had died, they would have had to get along without my support. In fact, for 2 years I had put off going to Bible school because it seemed my folks could not possibly get along without me. Now I was brought face to face with the issue as never before. I continued to seek God through the early morning hours. When it was time for the morning chapel service, I went downstairs and asked the Lord for one more sign from Him before making the final decision. After the opening song of the meeting, the speaker of the morning announced his text and read from Luke 9:62. "No man, having put his hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God." Without waiting to hear his message, I returned immediately to my room and wrote my reply to Mother. It was the most difficult letter I have ever written. I told her that I loved my family more than life itself, but God had called me, and I dared not turn back. I gave her the scriptures that God had given me and told her how these had been confirmed in the chapel service that morning. I assured her that I was praying that God would heal Father so he could return to work or raise up support from some other source. And I did earnestly pray that God would meet the need. Within a short time, I received another letter from home. Mother began by apologizing for writing me as she had done. She was proud of her son for deciding to follow God, and she would not have me return home for anything in the world. God had completely healed Father, and he was working at a better job than he had before, and a younger brother was now working and bringing in some support. Praise God. The previous year, while doing farm work, I had been able to help with the expenses of my sister Blanche when she enrolled at Beulah Heights ahead of me. Now both of us were thrust out into a life of sheer faith. Sometimes our needs were met supernaturally, and some of the time I found temporary or part-time jobs to earn what we needed. I shoveled coal at a mill a few hours a day for a while. During another period, I tended machinery in a factory. Though we sometimes had to do without some things, the Lord faithfully supplied our basic needs. When we graduated in 1920, all our financial obligations had been met. We owed no man anything. Blanche had received her missionary call before I received mine. While in missionary prayers one day, under a burden of prayer for the heathen, she saw AFRICA spelled out in letters of fire. While I too felt a special burden and love for the black man, I rather hoped I might be called to some other foreign field, since Blanche was called to Africa. However, Africa was also to become my own call and obsession. On March 26, 1919, while praying at Bible school, I saw a vision I will not describe here. Its effect was to convince me beyond all doubt that God wanted me to go as a missionary to somewhere on the African continent. I did not know just where. Shortly after I saw this vision, William Johnston, who had been one of the first Pentecostal missionaries to go to Liberia in 1908, came to speak at Beulah Heights. He told of the many unreached tribes in the interior and appealed for strong young men who could walk the trails and stand the hardships of that malaria-ridden country, then known as the white man's grave. I had asked the Lord to let me go to a hard field, a field where no one else was willing to go, and so my heart responded to the challenge. Blanche also felt that Liberia was where the Lord wanted her to go. My second year at Beulah Heights, Alfred N. Trotter enrolled as a student. He became my close friend and seemed like my younger brother. Alfred's sister Ruth, who was a schoolteacher in Newark, New Jersey, often came to visit him. I not only met her, but shared in the home-baked cookies she sometimes brought her brother. Alfred never stopped talking about his wonderful sister, and before long I thoroughly agreed with his evaluation. She was attractive, intelligent, lively, well-organized, and, most important of all, fully dedicated to the Lord. She was the youth group leader of her home church in Newark, of which E.S. Williams, later General Superintendent of the Assemblies of God, was pastor. And I discovered this outstanding girl also felt a call to Liberia. But romance had not much priority in the plans of either of us at the time. I had gone to Bible school for one purpose, to prepare to fulfill God's calling. Now I must follow that calling. Stepping out in faith. After graduating from Beulah Heights, Blanche and I went home to Connecticut for a brief visit. Father thought I might want to do farm work at least for the summer to get some money together. But I quoted Romans 11:29, "The gifts and callings of God are without repentance," which I took to mean I must leave for Africa just as soon as possible and trust God to meet my needs. I agreed to stay and work for 1 week, for which I was paid $15. As far as I am aware, that was the last money I ever received for secular employment. Of course, as a preacher and missionary, I have put in many long hours at hard labor building churches and mission buildings in connection with the work of the ministry. Blanche and I were invited by a former Beulah Heights student to come and conduct some meetings in Dolington, New Jersey. The people who invited us had absolutely no money to pay the $1 per night rental required for the use of the town hall, but we felt led to undertake the obligation anyway. We went about the town all day inviting people to the meetings. At night I would preach in my limited way, and Blanche would sing. Night after night, when we gave the invitation, people came forward for salvation, including the members of the town council from whom we had rented the building. In the end, they gave us back what Blanche and I had paid for rent, and an offering besides. Next, some friends in Philadelphia invited us to come preach in a city mission. Then we attended camp meetings at Media and Export, Pennsylvania. We shared our vision and our burden, receiving much well-meaning encouragement but little or no financial support. Blanche accepted an invitation to visit a friend in Ohio. I went to conduct meetings in New York State for my friend Frank Finkenbinder, later to become a lifetime missionary to Latin America, and father of the well-known Hermano Pablo Finkenbinder of radio and television. When I left Frank in Elmira, New York, I boarded a train for New York City where Blanche was to rejoin me. But God had plans for me I did not know about. A few stations after my journey began, I looked up as the train stopped and read Owego, New York. An inner voice said, "Get off the train." I argued that it was a foolish idea, that my ticket was to New York City, that I didn't know a soul in Owego, that I was practically penniless. It did no good. The inner voice of the Holy Spirit was loud and clear. So just as the brakeman was shouting, "All aboard!" and lifting this small step from the platform, I grabbed my cardboard suitcase containing my extra collar and socks and got off the train. Now what? I walked over to the station house and saw a poster advertising a Pentecostal camp meeting. A man with a team of horses was loading something on his wagon he had received from the train. I asked him if he knew where this camp meeting was being held. He said yes, and that he would soon be going that way and could give me a lift if I wanted. I accepted his kind offer and quickly reached the campground. It was a real tent city. As I approached the large meeting tent, an elderly, white-haired man came to meet me. "Are you a preacher?" he asked immediately. "Well, yes, that is, I'm a missionary to Africa," I blurted. I told him how the Lord had impressed me to get off the train at the Owego station, and when I saw the poster, I knew this was the place I was to come. He said, "Praise the Lord. He has answered our prayers. Our evangelist has lost his voice, and we have been praying that God would send us a preacher. Will you preach for us tonight?" I felt this was a big order for a Bible school student, but under the circumstances I was afraid to say no. It turned out that my invitation was from Brother F.S. Perkins, president of the Pentecostal Holiness Association of New York and Pennsylvania. I prayed the rest of the day and then stood up to preach. The large tent was filled, and it seemed there were as many people standing outside as there were inside. After a very short message, in which I felt I covered most of the Bible, I gave the altar call, and the aisles filled with people coming to kneel in the straw. I do not know how many were saved that night, nor how many were healed and filled with the Spirit. I only know that I was almost scared to death. After the service, the leaders of the camp asked me to preach again the following night, and I consented. I preached for several nights, praying all day and preaching at night, and each night the altars were filled with seekers. I soon understood why the scheduled evangelist had lost his voice. The campground was right beside the main railway line, a very Pentecostal location in those days, and every few minutes a monster double-header steam locomotive would come through, pulling a freight train to Buffalo. With no public address system and all that noisy competition, I too was reduced to a whisper after a few days, so I prepared to be on my way. But by now these dear people felt they knew me and took a great interest in my plans for going to Africa. Not only did they give me a generous love offering, but also told me they had been keeping $500 of missionary money in the bank, waiting for God to send along the right person to receive it. Surely God works in mysterious ways His wonders to perform. As a result of this camp meeting in Owego, the Pentecostal Holiness Association decided to support Blanche and me financially for our first term of missionary service in Africa. They later increased the support when each of us was married. Big doors on little hinges swing. Besides the support of the Pentecostal Holiness people, we received also the endorsement of the Brethren of the Eastern District Council of the Assemblies of God. 25 years later, I had occasion to read the remarks of E.S. Williams when he recommended me at that time. He wrote to the Foreign Missions Department, "The brother is young but full of zeal, and I think he will make a good missionary." The Assemblies of God granted our missionary appointments in the fall of 1920. So much had happened since Bible school graduation that spring. We had met numerous other missionaries, present and future. We had established a few roots among people who would pray for and support us. We had seen God supply the cost of our fare and basic outfit. Leaving all behind. Most important to me personally, I had become engaged to be married to Ruth Trotter, and she was at the New York pier to see us off when the time came to sail. Naturally, it was hard for Ruth and me to part, but we wanted God's will for our lives more than anything else in the world, and both of us felt the call of God should come first. I would go to Liberia and get a place ready for us to live, and as soon as her teaching contract was over, she would join me. I can almost see her yet, as through the tears we both waved while the ship slowly moved away from the pier and down the Hudson River. We wondered whether we would ever meet again. Missionary work was dangerous and uncertain, and I had given no thought at all to raising my return fare. My father and mother had also come to New York to see us off. They were giving up 2 children for the mission field in one day, but they were glad to do so. Many times during severe tests in Africa, we were to feel their prayers sustaining us. And so it was that by the grace of God and the help of many kind friends, we sailed out of New York Harbor on October 23, 1920, aboard the SS Carmania of the Cunard Steamship Company, bound for Liverpool, England, where we would take a ship for Africa. The voyage took 10 days. One of the highlights for Blanche and me was meeting for daily prayer and fellowship in the stateroom of fellow passenger Paul Rader, president of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, and an evangelist of Billy Graham-like stature at the time. We maintained correspondence with the raiders for some time afterward as they visited mission stations in many parts of the world. Our parents and friends gave us a number of dated envelopes to be opened on specific days of our crossing. 5 days out, I had my 23rd birthday, and an envelope from my mother contained a poem she had written for the occasion. It seemed to me that day the most wonderful piece of poetry I had ever read. Birthday greetings to Henry. God bless my boy this morning, a happy, bright birthday while on the ocean sailing from home so far away. Though far from home and loved ones, our prayers are with you still. We trust our Heavenly Father to keep you from all ill. This day brings to remembrance the one so long ago when you were a tiny baby launched on life's sea of woe. The cold and snows of winters and summers 23 have passed since that bright morning when you were given to me. All through the days of childhood and boyhood's happy years, a comfort to your mother through many trials and tears. And now upon the ocean you're nearing England's shore, and soon again be sailing to Africa's open door, to the country of Liberia, into the white man's grave, to the land where Jesus calls you some precious soul to save. But he will go before you, and with you his spirit fill. Lo, I am with you alway. His promise he'll fulfill. Chapter 2. The White Man's Grave. I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. Psalm 32, verse 8. The SS Carmania docked in Liverpool on the Mersey River at 3 p.m. November 1, 1920. We were met by an agent of Edwards Brothers Forwarding Agency, who escorted us to a reputable boarding house. Wide-eyed and shivering in its underheated rooms, Blanche and I were already thousands of miles farther from home than we had ever been before. Here we were in England, the country of our ancestors, to await passage on another ship to take us more thousands of miles to West Africa. We had left New York before we had definite reservations for passage from Liverpool to Cape Palmas, Liberia. A great many ships had been sunk by the Germans during the First World War, making it difficult to secure bookings to West Africa. Some friends had advised us to wait until definite bookings were confirmed before leaving the USA, but we felt that as we stepped out in faith, he who had called us to Africa would go before us and prepare the way. Our names had been placed on the waiting list with a company which operated freight boats and an occasional passenger boat to West Africa. They told us it would be at least a month before we could expect to get passage, and that it would depend entirely on cancellations. After more than 3 long weeks of waiting, during which we stayed at a Pentecostal mission we had found, we were advised of a single cancellation on the SS Ikari, sailing the next morning. I accepted the vacancy and left Liverpool on November 24th. Another ship, the SS Boma, a week later had room for Blanche as well as the Alexander Howards, another missionary couple awaiting passage to Liberia. I was scheduled to go ashore at Monrovia, Liberia, and there transfer to the SS Boma, which by then would have space, in order to reach Cape Palmas. But upon learning that the city of Monrovia was under quarantine because of a smallpox epidemic, I disembarked early at Freetown, Sierra Leone. I spent 1 week with missionaries there and had my first opportunity to preach to a group of Africans. A few days later, I joined Blanche and the Howards on the Boma headed for Cape Palmas. Brief History of Liberia. In 1817, the American Colonization Society was organized in the USA, and in 1822 its first expedition of freed slaves arrived on Providence Island off the coast of Liberia. From that date until now, freed slaves or their descendants have crossed the Atlantic in small numbers to settle on the Liberian coast. A white American minister, who at the request of the society went out to aid the new settlement, invented the name Liberia, meaning free. Land was acquired from the natives, and the town of Monrovia started and named after U.S. President Monroe. Following the example of England, which authorized its men to board slave ships and release the slaves in Freetown, Sierra Leone, the American Navy was empowered to seize slave ships on the high seas and release the captives in Liberia. The new community suffered from hunger and disease, and many of the early settlers died, but gradually their number increased. In 1973, it was estimated that there were still no more than 12,000 to 15,000 Americo-Liberians living scattered along the coast. The tribespeople of the interior numbered perhaps 1 million, but no accurate census has ever been taken. Liberian independence was recognized in 1862, but the government had many difficulties both with economic management and with the native tribes of the interior. Missions in Liberia. For many years, Liberia was known as the white man's grave, owing to its extremely unhealthful climate. The death rate among missionaries was so high that some mission societies decided to pull out of the country, believing it impossible to evangelize. Of 79 missionaries sent to Liberia by the Church Missionary Society of London before 1830, 44 died of fever during their first year of service. Of 75 sent out by the American Presbyterian Board, 31 died within a very short time, and many others returned home ill. Out of a large party of Methodist missionaries led by Bishop Taylor in 1895, only Miss Jessie Arms survived a siege of fever. In 1900, a party of 10 missionaries, including Mr. and Mrs. John Perkins and Miss Arms, who was returning for her second term, arrived in Liberia. Mr. Perkins reported that after 3 months there were only 2 left, he and Miss Arms. His first wife having died, he and Jessie were married in Liberia and under God were spared to carry on the work in spite of many hardships for over 40 years. While on furlough during 1907 and 1908, the Perkins heard about the Pentecostal revival that was sweeping America. They attended a camp meeting and received the baptism of the Holy Spirit. With this new equipment, they felt they were now better fitted to face the problems of pioneer missionary work in Liberia. They applied to the Methodist Board of Missions for reappointment, but were turned down because of their Pentecostal experience. There were no organized Pentecostal groups in those days, so they returned to the field independently. God not only supplied their fare and outfit, but raised up 6 other Pentecostal missionaries to accompany them, including John Harrow of Canada. They did not wish to be unethical by going in near the established work of the Methodist mission where they had once labored, when there was so much unevangelized territory in the hinterland. So they prayed for guidance as the ship approached Liberia and received the impression that Garraway, 30 miles northwest of Cape Palmas, was the place where the party should go ashore. They told the ship's captain they wanted to be put off the boat at Garraway. The captain told them this would be impossible, that a ship had never stopped offshore at Garraway, and the danger from submerged rocks was great. Furthermore, the captain would be in danger of losing his job if he ventured to do such a thing. Mr. Perkins insisted that God had spoken to them in a vision and had told them to get off the ship at Garraway. Finally, the captain said, "If God told you to get off at Garraway, then Garraway it shall be. But you must take full responsibility for what happens to you and your party in getting ashore." To this, Perkins and Harrow readily agreed. So on Christmas morning, 1908, the ship anchored 2 miles offshore, and the party of 8 missionaries was lowered over the side of the ship in a mammy chair into a lifeboat and rowed ashore at Garraway. As their little boat was beached, an excited African named Jasper came rushing up to them and said, "I know who you are. You are missionaries. God appeared to me in a dream while I was at home in the interior and told me to come to Garraway to meet a party of missionaries who would come to my tribe to preach the gospel. Just follow me and I will show you the way to the Baroba tribe." This story sounds like one recorded in Acts 10 concerning Simon Peter and Cornelius. The party followed Jasper into the interior to the Baroba tribe and established the first Pentecostal mission at Niwaka. Jasper had been converted while attending a Methodist mission school on the coast. He soon sought for and received the baptism of the Holy Spirit and was a great help to the early missionaries. From overexposure and long marches through the forest and fording flooded streams and marshes while out preaching, Jasper contracted tuberculosis. It was my sad duty to bury this dedicated man of God about a year after I reached Liberia. Within about a year after their arrival, almost all the members of this first party of Pentecostal missionaries, as well as the workers who had joined them, had either died or been sent home with broken health. It is conservatively estimated that during the first 25 years of the Pentecostal work in Liberia, no less than a missionary a year died of malaria or some other tropical disease, and many others were sent home because of serious illness. Our arrival. On the morning of December 19, 1920, the Boma anchored offshore at Cape Palmas. A surf boat flying the Liberian flag and manned by native oarsmen pulled alongside, and 2 Liberian officials for customs and immigration climbed the rope ladder to the deck. A little later, a boat brought the ship Cape Palmas agent and a missionary, William Johnston, to meet us. It was through missionary Johnston's ministry at home that we had received our call to Liberia. After considerable red tape, the ship was cleared for landing passengers. We, with our few items of baggage, were placed in a kind of square box with board seats facing each other, called a mammy chair, and swung over the side by the ship's hoist into the waiting surf boat bobbing up and down in the rough sea below. Our mammy chair hit the rolling surf boat with a tremendous thump. We climbed out of the chair into the tossing boat with the help of many black hands that reached out to steady us. The experience of the new missionary landing in West Africa is graphically described by Jean Mackenzie in her book, An African Trail, written early in this century. She wrote, "Give a thought to him as he goes over the ship's side. In the main, he is young. His helmet is new against the sun. His baggage is all zinc or tin or Japan steel against the rains and the roaches and the white ants. He sits in the surf boat between the brown bodies of the rowers who line the gunwales. They sing the song of rowing. They rise and fall to the paddle with the impeccable rhythm of their race. The new man marks the incredible white of their teeth and the whites of their brilliant eyes. His unused attention is wine to them. They shout and swing in an accelerated and measured frenzy as one man. They are the sinews of the hand that Africa has put out to pluck the white man from the deck where he stood among his brothers, those that speak his tongue and follow his customs. By that hand he will be led along what lonely paths to what foreign experiences. That black hand may become to him hateful or dear. It may crush him, or it may, after rainy seasons and dry, replace him on a deck of a steamer making north. But be sure of this, the print of those fingers is upon him, the spirit and the body of him to the end of his days. That imprint is upon him like the scar of the lion's paw on the arm of Livingstone." After clearing customs in Cape Palmas, we engaged a surf boat to take us and our baggage the following day to Garraway, about 30 miles back up the coast, from where the trip to the interior was to begin. There were no hotels in Cape Palmas, but I managed to secure sleeping quarters in the Methodist Mission, and Blanche stayed at the steamship agent's residence. At 5 a.m. the next day we set out for Garraway. The native boatmen hoisted a sail, and we were sometimes driven at a rapid pace along the coast. At times it seemed we would be dashed to pieces on the rocks. Then there would be a calm, during which the oarsmen were supposed to row, but they generally decided to take a nap while waiting for the wind to become more favorable. Mr. Johnson and Blanche were very seasick, and I sang, "The end is not yet," to add to their discomfort. It so happens that I have never been seasick, but I usually refrain from admitting it after hearing that only idiots are immune to seasickness. The trip on the surf boat was very trying. The sun beat down, and the glare from the sea in an open boat was almost blinding. We tried to hold umbrellas over our heads for protection. It was a relief when the sun went down, but we did not reach Garraway until 1:30 the next morning, sunburned, weather-beaten, and very tired. A day and a night in an open surf boat on a tropical sea is no picnic, and 20 hours to go 30 miles is not very fast traveling. Garraway, which was to be our jumping-off place to still more primitive parts, had already been the site of much missionary sacrifice. Long before the landing of Perkins and Harrow, a Methodist station had been opened in 1887 by a Reverend and Mrs. Gortner, accompanied by their 2 sons, ages 14 and 9, and a Mrs. Meeker. Fever had struck them all as soon as they reached Garraway. Agnes McAllister, herself a missionary to Garraway a short time later, wrote, "Mr. Gortner, his wife, and elder son, and Mrs. Meeker were all confined to bed at the same time. Only the younger son and an old Liberian woman were able to do anything for the sick. Mrs. Meeker, who was well on in years and not very strong, was the first to die from the fever. It was in the afternoon. And in the evening of the same day, Mr. Gortner went to be with Jesus, leaving his wife and son too sick to help themselves or to attend to burying their dead. The 2 dead bodies lay there until the 3rd day before anything was done toward burying them. Some sailors, hearing of the death at the mission, went up and made 2 coffins from the board partitions of the house and buried the bodies. Mrs. Gortner, who was too sick to stand on her feet, crept on her hands and knees to take a last look at her husband. When Bishop Taylor at Cape Palmas heard the news, he went to Garraway to look after Mrs. Gortner and the 2 boys. They recovered and returned to America. Now Garraway was once more seeing the arrival of new missionaries, but Blanche and I would not be staying. A group of porters and hammock men were waiting for us, having been engaged by Mr. Johnson to carry our loads and assist us to reach Newaka in time for the annual Christmas convention, which was to begin on Christmas Eve. At Garraway, we divided our outfits into head loads, and at 3 a.m. on December 24, we headed for Newaka. It was a distance of 35 miles, normally considered a good 2-day walk through dense forest and jungle. Much of the way, Blanche was carried in a hammock made of a piece of light canvas hemmed at each end with a piece of clothesline rope threaded through the hem and tied to a bamboo pole. At each end of the pole was a strong native who balanced the pole on his head, using a rolled circle of leaves or grass for padding. Since the jungle path was very narrow, the whole party had to walk single file. The men of the caravan sang and shouted in rhythm as we traveled along. The trail was very crooked, as the Africans always detoured around fallen trees and branches rather than cut them out of the way. It was difficult at times to know whether the songs of the marchers came from in front or from behind. Sometimes the carriers and hammock men trotted along at a good rate, and at other times slowed down to cross streams or rises of high ground. The caravan rested briefly at intervals, usually near a stream. In mid-morning and again in mid-afternoon, all stopped for a meal beside the trail or in a small village. Some of the boys carried rice and a 3-legged pot in which to cook, for the Johnsons shot a few monkeys along the trail to go with the rice. It seemed that whole tribes of monkeys passed through the forest over our heads most of the trip. The foul odor at times was almost stifling. Finally, footsore and weary, we reached Newaka Mission Station at about 6 p.m. the same day we had started, having made the long march in about 15 hours. We received a warm welcome by the missionaries and native Christians who had gathered for the convention beginning that night. I recorded in my diary, "It is wonderful to be in the land of our adoption. Our first Christmas in Africa, December 25, 1920. I was asked to baptize the 24 candidates who were ready for water baptism. This was a great experience for a rookie missionary." After Christmas, Blanche and I went to Plebo Mission Station to assist Mr. and Mrs. Edgar Personius, arriving there on New Year's Day, 1921. Trip to Pan. Pan is spelled P-A-H-N. Leaving Blanche at Plebo on January 13, I returned to Newaka to accompany Mr. Johnson on a trip to the interior. He was interested in the Pan tribe, which had never had the gospel. They were reported to be cannibals. After a 9-day march through incredibly dense forest and almost impenetrable jungle and bush, and wading through swamps and swollen streams, we finally reached Rodeli, the first large village of these warlike people. Word had reached the Pans that 2 white men with porters were approaching their village. Being forewarned meant very literally being forearmed in this case. We were met at the outskirts of the village by a group of warriors carrying cutlasses, spears, bows and arrows, and cudgels. Our caravan halted as our carriers cried out that we did not bring war or trouble, but came peaceably and would do them no harm. When they saw that we were unarmed and our manner seemed friendly, they lowered their weapons and allowed us to enter the village of Rodeli. This tribe had never been subdued by the Liberian government, so the people carried out their own customs and practices as had their ancestors before them. They had heard how government soldiers had invaded and subjected other tribes near the coast, so were determined to fight to retain their independence. Consequently, they were very suspicious of strangers who ventured near their private domain. We were the first white men they had ever seen, and also the first people they had ever seen fully clothed. Some of them wore loincloths made from grass or leaves or from the bark of trees, but most of them were completely naked. Many of them wore their hair braided in numerous pencil-thick braids, and all of them had their front teeth filed to a point. We made our way to the center of the village where the chief's court was usually held. Most of the women and children hid themselves as the men cautiously approached us. While none of the men in our caravan knew the Pan language, there were those who knew some words spoken by a tribe adjacent to the Palm people. So by relying on faulty interpretation and gesticulations, we managed to make the chief know we wanted a place to stay for the night. At first we were flatly refused, and some of the men cynically told us to go sleep with the monkeys in the bush. They told the chief, King Tho, they were suspicious of us and we should not be trusted. However, after much persuasion, which included presenting King Tho with a blanket, We succeeded in convincing him that we were not representatives of the government and were not there to do them any harm. We were assigned huts for our little company, and after a meal consisting mostly of rice, we stretched out on our army cots for the night. I was exhausted from the 9-day trek through the jungle and was grateful that our party had a roof over our heads for the night. After a few hours of sleep, however, I was awakened in the dead of the night by the sound of voices outside the hut. I tried to look around the hut to see if anyone had entered, but a smothering blanket of darkness lay over everything. It was impossible to see, and I felt I dared not light a torch. I lay awake, staring into the blackness, wondering what these people were saying and what I should do. Knowing they were cannibals made the experience even more frightening, but I felt all I could do was to commit the matter to the Lord and pray for His peace and power to prevail. I soon fell asleep again, and the night passed without incident. We spent several days in Rodeli near the foot of Mount Gita, and King Tho became very friendly. He listened attentively to the story of salvation we tried to tell him, and he finally consented to allow John Yeda and Timothy, our 2 native workers from Baroba, to live among his people and tell them more about the good news of the gospel. This was a major victory of the entire trip. With the help of some of the villagers, we managed to erect a small 2-room rectangular house before leaving for home. John and Timothy returned to Baroba with us in order to get their families. The Pan natives had given Mr. Johnson and me new names, Kui Yonsini and Kui Kali. Kali was as near as they could come to saying Garlock, so I became known to them as Kui Kali, which meant white bird. Tragedy at Niwaka. We arrived back at Niwaka on February 18, having been away for 32 days. Mr. Johnson felt that if all went well in locating 2 native workers and their families in a Pan village for a few months, he would open the way for missionaries to eventually go among them to live. It took real courage and dedication on the part of John and Timothy to volunteer to live among these people. From Niwaka, I returned to Bliba to join Blanche and Mr. and Mrs. Personius. Shortly after my arrival, Blanche was stricken with her first attack of malaria fever and ran a very high temperature for a week. Many missionaries have died from their first attack of malaria. It had been the custom of the mission that no one be left on a mission station alone until after having had his first bout with the fever. On March 14, after Blanche was almost recovered, I went to the Niwaka station to put doors and bamboo shutters on a mission house there. 10 days later, all the missionaries and native workers were to gather there for an Easter convention. As we approached Niwaka, a terrible tropical storm broke upon us, accompanied with great claps of thunder and streaks of lightning. The rain came down in a cloudburst, and we were soaked to the skin as we swished along on the narrow snake-like trail. When we reached the station, we found that lightning had struck a huge cotton tree under which 7 schoolboys had taken shelter while trying to keep rice birds off the ripening rice at the mission farm. All but one boy were struck to the ground. He ran to the mission for help. 3 resident missionaries hurried to the scene of the tragedy and managed to revive 3 of the boys by applying artificial respiration. But since they were unable to work on the others in time, 3 of the boys died. Naturally, the convention began on a sad note. The first meeting was a funeral service. It was necessary to bury the dead immediately in that hot climate. After the evening service, when all the missionary workers had retired, we were suddenly awakened by a series of weird, blood-curdling sounds that warned the experienced missionary and native worker that the Avenger of Blood was on the march. In these primitive people's minds, no one ever died of natural causes. Some person was always held responsible for every death in the tribe. So after going through certain incantations, the local witch doctor had come up with the reason of the death of the 3 boys on the rice farm. According to him, it was some person or persons in the nearby village of Simlika who must be ferreted out and given the sasswood test. If, after having been compelled to drink the poison brew, the victim vomited, he was innocent. But if he died, as most did, he was guilty of bewitching the deceased. The Niwaka witch doctor and his men were now on their way to Simlika to demand that the sasswood test be administered to its people. The forest path to Simlika passed the mission station, and Mr. Johnson recognized the meaning of the weird night calls of the witch hunters. He called on the missionaries and native workers to help him block the trail to Simlika. We all hurriedly dressed and followed him. As the witch doctor and his men approached, Mr. Johnson remonstrated with them, and with the help of the native Christians physically restrained their leaders until we could talk to them. He told them that the Simlica people were not responsible for the lightning killing the boys, but that it was an act of nature. God had allowed it to happen to get their attention and to get them to repent and turn to God before anything worse happened. It turned out to be an all-night session. But this wise missionary under God was able to get the warriors to turn back, and in so doing doubtless averted a great deal of bloodshed and sorrow. The people of Simlica would certainly have resisted unto death the demands of the Niwaka townspeople. Chapter 3. Gropaka and the Wedding. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me. Isaiah 6, verse 8. On our way to Pan, William Johnson and I had passed through Gropaka and the abandoned mission station overlooking the town. The station had been closed owing to the death of its missionaries. It had been a sobering experience to find 2 graves marked with crude markers in a grove of trees near the mission station. Gropaka had been the farthest interior station of the Baroba tribe and in the center of quite a dense population. A vacant mission station is always heartbreaking, and my heart went out to the people of Gropaka and the surrounding territory. I asked Mr. Johnson to allow us to reopen the station. I knew that Ruth would join us on the field in a few months, and I was anxious to have a place ready for her when she arrived. The town chief, King Jufuli, and his elders came to the Easter conventions at Niwaka and begged that missionaries be sent to Gropaka to replace those who had died. When they were told that the new missionaries would reopen the mission, they were very happy. Blanche returned to Blibo with Mr. and Mrs. Personius after the convention, with the understanding that I would send for her as soon as I could get a room ready for her to occupy in the old house that was about ready to collapse. I reached Gropaka on April 13, 1921, to begin repairs on the premises. The mission house of hand-sawed boards was situated near 2 large cotton trees on the highest elevation in the yard. The boards had been sawed by natives under the supervision of a missionary. Trees had been felled in the forest and cut into 8 or 10-foot lengths. Then a pit had been dug deep enough for one man to stand upright in it and operate one end of a saw. At the top was another man, and together they slowly sawed enough boards to build a house. It usually took 1 whole day to get 1 board sawed out. The house was elevated on posts about 3 feet off the ground as a protection against termites and the dampness and mold in that unusually wet climate. Unfortunately, the material used was not termite-proof, so the white ants had eaten away most of the posts and wooden steps of the front and rear of the building. In fact, the front wooden steps collapsed as I entered, and many of the floorboards in the house crumbled under my weight. The abandoned house seemed to be a rendezvous for rats, snakes, scorpions, and huge tropical lizards. Of course, there were no glass windows, and the bamboo mats that had been used as shutters had been eaten away by the white ants. Settling in a new home. I placed my army cot in one room and hung a protecting mosquito net over it. I was told the net would frighten away wild animals also, so there was nothing to fear. The noise of the huge rats running across the floor at night annoyed me. The people of nearby Gropaka sang and danced most of the night to the monotonous beat of drums. The night calls of birds sounded at times like the cries of huge monsters, and the monkeys chattered incessantly in the bush. All this kept me from getting much sleep the first few nights, but the most heartbreaking thing happened the first week of my stay in our new home. I was awakened in the night by the terrified screams of a child of one of the families housed in a temporary hut on the compound. The small boy had stepped outside and was pounced upon by a prowling leopard and dragged away. His family, anguished but helpless in the darkness, could do nothing for him. All of us listened, horrified, as the poor little fellow's cries became more distant, then ceased. Next morning, in the high bush nearby, we found fragments of his skull and hands and feet. This frightening experience, following so closely on the sobering jolt I felt the day I arrived on the hill and looked at the lonely graves of the last 2 missionaries, banished any illusions I may have had about the glory of doing pioneer missionary work. I was now face to face with cold, stern, hard reality. I began to wonder if I were doing right to bring my sister and my prospective bride to live in such a dreadful place. But as I prayed and reflected on the matter, I soon realized that the girls had received their calls from God just as I had, and were willing to go through whatever suffering was required in order to bring the gospel to these benighted people. But I did feel very isolated and alone and far from civilization. There were no highways, no railroads, no bridges across streams, no cars, no horses, no phones, no local mail service. One could not use a bicycle because of swamps and marshes, and the foot trails through the forest were just narrow ruts the width of a bare foot. Pack animals could not live because of the tsetse fly, which carried sleeping sickness. Some missionaries had imported horses and donkeys, but they survived only a few weeks. While these disadvantages seemed formidable enough, the thing most dreaded by the missionary was the certainty of malaria fever. Since many had succumbed to it, life itself for the rest of us was very uncertain. In the truest sense, one could only hope to live for one day at a time. In his book, Tropical Africa, published by John B. Allen, New York, 1890, Henry Drummond relates how he visited the Livingston Mission in Nyasaland and found that the whole missionary staff had died of malaria fever before he reached the place. A native led him to a grove of mimosa trees under which they were buried. He said, "The pestilence that wasteth at midnight had made this beautiful spot its home." He further wrote, "Malaria fever is the one sad certainty which every African traveler must face. For months he may escape, but its finger is upon him, and well for him if he has a friend near when it finally overtakes him." The previous missionaries to Gropaka had not only worked very hard to build as permanent a dwelling as possible, but had brought with them enough woven wire fencing to enclose the mission compound. But when we reached Gropaka, most of the wire fence had disappeared. We later recognized it in bracelets, anklets, and neck pieces. Jewelry-wise, the natives had struck the jackpot. Eventually, we managed to replace the fence with posts from a certain tree we found would grow into a hedge if set out just before or during the rainy season, before the white ants had time to eat it. These were called gross sticks by the natives. After I got a room completed so that Blanche would have a place to call her own, she came over from Blibo and joined me in Gropaka. We were both very anxious to get as much as possible done on the place before Ruth arrived. In addition to working on the house, we kept a crew busy clearing the yard, which, because of disuse, had grown into a jungle. The old mud and thatched building in the yard, which had been used as a chapel and school, had completely collapsed, so we proceeded to build one to replace it. We held Sunday school and church services under one of the big cotton trees for a time. With a sharp stick, I drew a rectangular plan on the ground, some 30 by 50 feet, and a small trench was dug to begin the building operations. With cutlasses, the natives cut down small trees in the forest to about the size of bean poles, which were driven into the ground about 6 inches apart. Across these poles we tied split bamboo strips to act as laths to hold mud plaster. Tons of dirt were dug up at one end of the mission yard, and water was carried in on the heads of the workmen from a stream at the foot of the mission hill. The mud and water were stomped into a thick paste by foot and smeared by hand on both sides of the bamboo strips. Though the walls ended up thicker in some places than others, and far from plumb, they all looked good to us and to the natives. Larger trees were cut and carried to the yard for rafters, and gangs of men and boys cut long grass and certain leaves and palm branches for thatch. It was thrilling to watch the long lines of carriers appear in single file, men as trees walking, with the roof material on their heads. When the building was completed, we held a dedication service and invited King Jufuli and his elders and the townspeople. The small building was packed African fashion, and there were more people outside than in. Quite a few indicated their desire to repent and serve the Lord, so we were greatly encouraged. Meeting Ruth. On June 25, 1921, a runner brought a cablegram from Ruth advising that she had left Liverpool on the SS Patani, a freight boat, on June 4th. I rounded up some hammock men and porters and left Gropaka for Cape Palmas. Reaching Garraway on the coast, I left the hammock men and some of the porters and proceeded by surf boat to the Cape. Mr. Johnson and another missionary were at Cape Palmas waiting for a boat to take them home via Germany. They left 2 days before Ruth arrived. I learned that the Patani was expected to reach Cape Palmas early Sunday morning, June 26. I was up at daybreak and saw the ship approaching from a distance. We had waited so long for this day to come. It was 8 long months since Ruth and I had parted in New York. As soon as the ship dropped anchor, which seemed to me to be in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, I boarded a surf boat with the agent and made for the ship. I had seen the Patani through a telescope at the agent's office before we left shore, and on her deck, looking wistfully toward the shore, was the most beautiful girl in the whole world, mine. I could hardly wait until we pulled alongside. It is difficult to describe the thrill of that reunion. We had to wait for the Liberian port officials to go through the formalities of clearing the ship before I was permitted to make my way by a rope ladder to the deck. At last, we were in each other's arms. Ruth had traveled all those thousands of miles alone, but the day we had hoped and prayed for and dreamed about had finally arrived. How good God was to each of us. After Ruth had identified her luggage, we were put over the side of the ship in a mammy chair and lowered to a surf boat below. It was identical to the experience that Blanche and I had had the previous December. Steamers called so infrequently at Cape Palmas in those days, and the white people who landed there were so few, it was always an event for the native oarsmen to be able to row a new white person ashore. Consequently, they had to show off their skill before Ruth. It took considerable time to clear Ruth's few belongings, as the Liberian customs officials demanded that everything be unpacked and displayed before them in order to assess duty. The wife of the steamship agent arranged to put Ruth up for the night, and I was able to stay with a European trader. A young Pentecostal brother from Minnesota had boarded the Patani in Liverpool, so was a fellow passenger of Ruth's all the way to Cape Palmas. He was also headed for an interior mission, so decided to accompany us as far as Garraway. On June 27, we engaged a surf boat for Garraway. The experience was similar to the one described earlier, although having a stronger wind for the sail, we reached Garraway in a shorter period of time. But the open surf boat from Cape Palmas is very trying. Some have managed to escape seasickness all the way from New York to Cape Palmas and then become desperately seasick on the small surf boat. Both Ruth and the other new missionary were very seasick. We reached Garraway rather late in the evening. I later learned how Ruth reported the arrival. She said, "When we reached Garraway, it was pitch black, and I could see absolutely nothing. The boatmen were all talking at once and shouting at someone on shore. The forepart of the surf boat ran onto the sandy beach and stopped. Then there was a mad scramble, and I was totally in the dark in more ways than one. Henry said, 'Honey, just sit still where you are until someone comes for you.' So I sat. A short time later, I heard a black man say, 'Mammy, you ready to go now?' I said, 'Yes, I'm ready,' and stood up. He took my arm and led me very carefully to the prow and said, 'Now, stand still.' I could not see him or anything else, but heard him moving around. He had stepped over the side into the water, which was about knee-deep, for him. Then he said, 'Mammy, come.' I put my arm out to grope for something to hold on to steady me, and found his outstretched arm. Then I asked, 'How am I ever going to get to shore through the water?' He answered, 'Mammy, I go carry you.' So saying, he picked me up as one would a small child, one strong arm under my shoulders and one under my knees. He carried me through the surf and stood me on a rock and said, 'Don't move.' Henry had been carried ashore piggyback and had sent this native to carry me. In a few seconds, Henry spoke. 'Don't be afraid, honey. It's so awful dark, but you're all right now.' Then he led me along the sandy beach to the mission house, whose lighted windows were a welcome sight. Our wedding. While waiting for Edgar Personius to arrive at Garraway from Blibo to perform the marriage ceremony, Ruth and I packed her outfit in head-load-sized bundles for the porters. We tried to make the load waterproof, but this was not always possible. We usually did tie banana leaves around most of the bundles. We were married at 3 in the afternoon, June 28, 1921. Mr. and Mrs. Howard, who had arrived in Liberia with Blanche and me, stood up with us, and our audience was made up of our hammock men and porters. I had secured a marriage license in Cape Palmas a few days before. Ruth had given me her class ring from normal school before we parted in New York. I had a native blacksmith in Cape Palmas make a wedding ring for me to give her, using the gold from an English sovereign. I paid him with another gold sovereign for making the ring. This was in the days when one could carry gold coins without penalty. Ruth is still very proud of her African-made wedding ring. The day after the wedding, we rose at 2 a.m. and started for Newaka. For the first leg of the journey, Ruth and I each rowed in a small dugout canoe on a crocodile-infested river. It was several miles to the landing where our hammock men were to meet us. It was almost pitch black with no moon, but the African paddlers seemed able to find their way around bends in the stream and under the overhanging branches of the swampland. I warned Ruth to keep her hands inside her canoe because of the crocodiles. After we disembarked from the canoes, Ruth was carried over the bush trail by hammock, but because it had been difficult to get hammock men, I walked all the way to Newaka. It was a long, hard trip, as we had not taken sufficient time to rest at Garraway after the ordeal in the surf boat coming from Cape Palmas. The rainy season had begun, which was one reason I felt compelled to push along before the streams and marshes became completely impassable. Beaten by the rain, it was very difficult for the carriers to walk the slippery, snake-like trail, and at times we had to wade in water waist-deep. Mile after mile we sloshed along. As David Livingstone once said about a trip with his family in the rain, "We got soaked by going on and sodden if we stood still." We finally reached Newaka Mission Station just before dark, seemingly more dead than alive. I had been able to secure only 4 hammock men for Ruth for the trip, which under the circumstances was really not sufficient. The 4 alternated in carrying the hammock, but from slipping and sliding in the mud and wading swamps and streams, these fine African men were taxed almost to the limit of their strength. In fact, one of the men, called Banker, a name given him earlier by a sea captain, drenched again and again on the trip, contracted malaria soon afterward, and died 2 or 3 days after reaching his home in Gropaka. He was one of the most courteous and kind-hearted men, and was very solicitous of Ruth's well-being because she was a new missionary. He frequently would ask, "How we go do for Mammy?" The missionaries at Newaka wanted us to stay over for a few days, but because of threatening rain and knowing that Blanche was waiting for us at Gropaka, we wanted to reach our journey's end as soon as possible. We reached Gropaka at 3 p.m. on June 30th, 1921. Blanche and the school children and many of the townspeople were gathered to welcome us. It was a great welcome, and how wonderful it was to be home in Africa together at last. But it took several days to recuperate from the effects of the long, hard trip from Cape Palmas. King Jufuli of Gropaka presented us with a young steer to butcher in celebration of our wedding, and blind Moses Tai gave us a goat. We supplied 100 pounds of rice, and our mission boys cut several bunches of palm nuts from palm trees surrounding the compound to cook with the meat as gravy or sauce, known to the people as palm butter, which was in turn strongly seasoned with red pepper. It took several hours to prepare the meal, but only a few minutes for the crowd that gathered to devour every bit of it. After the wedding feast, we conducted a gospel service in which many indicated a desire to follow Christ. Chapter 4. Miracle at Sorika. I was no prophet, neither was I a prophet's son, but I was an herdman, and a gatherer of sycamore fruit. And the Lord took me as I followed the flock, and the Lord said unto me, Go. Amos 7, verses 14 and 15. Just 1 week after arriving with Ruth at Gropaka, a letter came from the mission station at Newaka saying Esther Sandstrom was very ill with malaria. The 2 other lady missionaries said they were both nearly worn out from caring for the sick, and suggested that perhaps Blanche would be willing to come to Newaka to help with the nursing. She hated to leave Gropaka so soon after Ruth's arrival, but felt duty-bound to respond to the appeal. She left early the next day and managed to get across the Sorika River before it overflowed its banks. About midnight, 4 days later, native runners brought the sad news of Esther's death. The Newaka missionaries requested that I come there to conduct a funeral service. They also wrote that Blanche had come down with malaria upon her arrival at Newaka and was running a high fever. It was an unwritten rule of the mission that no new missionary be left alone until after having had his first attack of malaria. Ruth hadn't had her first fever yet, and it was risky to leave her alone. But we both felt there was nothing else to do but for me to hurry to Newaka to bury Esther and see what could be done for Blanche. I immediately sent a runner to Nanaimo to ask if one of the missionaries there, Sophia Nygaard, could come and stay with Ruth while I was gone to Niwaka. Promising to return just as soon as possible, I left early on July 12 for Niwaka. Sophia arrived at Gropaka shortly after I left. Crossing the river. The letter carriers who had come the night before told us they had experienced great difficulty in reaching us at Gropaka because the river was beginning to flood. As I approached the Sorika River, I wondered whether it would be possible for me to get to Niwaka without serious difficulty. Under normal circumstances, I would not have attempted to cross the river at that time of year. But knowing the broken-hearted missionaries were expecting me to help comfort them and conduct Esther's funeral, I earnestly prayed that God would go before me. As I came closer to the stream, I saw that the river was not only a raging torrent, but the lowlands on either side of the river were flooded as well. What was I to do? I stood on a piece of high ground, looking out across the flooded area and the swirling stream beyond, wondering just how I could get to the other side. That is all I remember. The next thing I knew, I was walking into the yard of the Niwaka mission station. My clothes did not appear to be wet except from perspiration. None of my carriers was with me, and they did not reach the station until many hours later. Ruth later told me that some of my porters had returned to Gropaka that same day, saying they could not get across the Sorika, and they did not know what had happened to me. They never had caught up with me. In the midst of their grief, the missionaries at Niwaka asked me how I got across the Sorika waters, and I simply told them that the Lord had helped me. I did not know what else to say. Whether I was carried by the Spirit like Philip at Azotus, Acts chapter 8, verse 40, I do not know. But I do know that all things are possible with God. The miracle was not performed for my sake, but for the sake of the grief-stricken missionaries who needed help at the time. To this day, I have no other explanation but that it was a miracle of God. Esther Sandstrom was laid to rest beside a number of other missionary heroes who loved not their lives unto the death, and of whom the world was not worthy. She was a very zealous and dedicated Swedish sister and greatly loved by all who knew her. Blanche was still bedfast and unable to attend the funeral. The next day she begged me to take her home with me to Gropaka, as she claimed she could smell death everywhere in the mission house. She said, "They will call you to bury me in a few days if you do not take me home with you." The other missionaries advised that she wait until she was stronger before attempting the trip to Gropaka. I knew that if she did die at Niwaka within the next few days, that I would never forgive myself for abandoning her. Her plea was that Gropaka was her home, and Ruth would be glad to help care for her until she was strong again. What was I to do under such circumstances? While I was at Niwaka, word came from Blebo that Mrs. Personius, suffering from malaria, had nearly died the day before. So it seemed the very air was laden with death. Against the warnings and seemingly good advice of the other missionaries, I decided to take Blanche with me regardless of the outcome. I confess I was moved by her tears and the thought of her dying away from Ruth and me. She was only 21 years of age. Our return journey. I acquired some hammock men to carry Blanche, as she was too weak to walk. We started out early the next morning for Gropaka. Remembering how the Lord had helped me on my way to the funeral, I hoped that we might enjoy a similar experience on our way home. However, this was not to be. Long before reaching the main Sorika stream, we found the lowlands flooded as much as waist deep. I had the porters cut down trees and tried to make a raft with green logs, but it soon sank under my weight. I told Blanche that she had better let me return her to Niwaka, where I would come for her at a later date, but she insisted that if I left her, I would never see her alive again. So we struggled on. By having Blanche carried on the shoulders and heads of the hammock men, we finally reached the brink of the main channel. After what seemed like hours of maneuvering, some husky natives succeeded in stretching long tai-tai vines across the raging torrent and tied them to some large trees on either side of the river. This they did by plunging into the swift current far above the place of the proposed crossing and being carried downstream as they fought their way to the opposite bank. After the vines were secured, and we were assured by the natives that they would hold our weight, we pushed out into the main current. Bestman, a strong native Christian, took the lead. Blanche, who could not swim and was so ill with malaria, followed. We placed the vine rope under her armpits, and I followed close behind, trying to hold her up. The vine rope bowed downstream with our weight, but we got along fairly well until we reached the middle of the stream, and started to pull ourselves up on the other side. Our feet were carried straight out downstream by the force of the current. In midstream, Blanche completely collapsed and became a dead weight, and was pulled under the water several times in spite of our efforts to keep her head above water. It seemed she would drown in spite of all we could do, but big, strong best man said, "Suppose Mammy go die today? Me too. I go die with her." And he meant it. When it seemed we could go no farther, or that the vine would certainly break, we managed to pull ourselves along hand over hand, inch after inch, until we finally made it to the opposite bank. If Best Man and I had not been given supernatural strength, I know we never could have made it. And we still had to wade through waist-deep water for about a quarter of a mile. There was no place where we could change our wet clothes, and no dry ones to be had in any case. So we struggled on to Gropaka. Blanche was several days recovering from the ordeal, but she was thrilled to be back home in Gropaka again with Ruth and me. The fever strikes. It has been estimated by some that during the decade or two after Livingston and Stanley, as many as 1/3 of the pioneer missionaries throughout Africa died within a year of reaching the field. Most of them were in their early 20s and never survived their first attack of malaria. Had they lived, their names might have been listed among Africa's great. No doubt loneliness and homesickness played a big part in hastening their deaths. Ruth came down with her first attack of malaria just 6 weeks after reaching the field. She had gotten up that morning, as she said, feeling funny. She sat for about 2 hours at the sewing machine making clothes for the school children. At the lunch table, she said she felt cold and asked Matthew to bring her sweater. When I served her plate, she looked at it and me and said, shivering, "I just can't eat." It dawned on me she was coming down with malaria, so I sent her to bed. She called for me a little later. When I went into the bedroom, she was having such violent chills the bed was shaking. We piled all available blankets on her until she said she couldn't move. After a while, the chills subsided and the fever came. When the fever broke about 10 that night, she perspired profusely. She felt so weak and drained of strength she thought she would be an invalid for the rest of her life. Very gradually her strength returned. I made a cake for her birthday on August 12th, after sifting the bugs and worms from the moldy flour. She was able to come to the table for a little while, and in 2 days' time was completely recovered. Speaking of baking cakes, I remember one occasion when a small keg of flour we had ordered from Cape Palmas arrived at our station, very dark and moldy and filled with bugs and worms. With my next order of supplies, I sent a letter by carrier to the manager of the trading post, describing the condition of this particular batch of flour. None of it was ever good, but this was worse than most. Shortly after that, I had a letter from him as follows. Kavala River Trading Company, Cape Palmas, 15th September, 1921. H.B. Garlock, Esquire, Gropaka Station, Interior. Dear Mr. Garlock, I have this morning received your favor of the 5th instant, and much regret to note that the flour recently purchased from us was received in such a bad condition. I have consulted my private information bureau and learned that the barrel was accidentally dropped in the water during the unloading operation at Garaway. This will account for the sepia tint. The animal life in the barrel is, of course, inevitable in West Africa, and after a time one gets used to bugs instead of currants. This is a live firm, and all our flour is live stuff. So I refrain from inflicting another barrel of horrors on you. Instead, I am sending you by bearer 36 yards of blue baft, a thin blue material, and trust you will find this in order. Regarding the previous barrel, I think the best thing you can do about it is bury it. If you don't want to have it under your particular compound, just direct it to Cape Palmas. It will no doubt come home itself. Yours sincerely, William S. Murdoch. The original letter from Mr. Murdoch is under glass in a frame in the foyer of the Gospel Publishing House in Springfield, Missouri. Chapter 5. Fetish Worship Challenged. And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. Mark 16, verses 17 and 18. One entrance to Gropaka village was guarded by a large fetish or juju house. The house was built in the form of an arch made of wooden poles and thatched with grass, and all who entered the village had to pass under it. There was a settee on each side of the path made of bamboo poles. On one seat sat an image of a man made with goat's hair, shells, and mud. On the opposite side were 2 earthen jars which served as beehives. The bees belonged to the fetish and were considered sacred, but they could be menacing at times to those passing through the shelter going to or from town. Our mission station was located on a hill at the opposite side of town from the big juju. We noticed that many of the people wore fetishes around their necks or about their waists, and fetish charms hung from above the doorways of their huts. Special celebrations were held in honor of the large fetish and directed by the local witch doctor or fetish priest. On moonlight nights, the people would sometimes sing and dance all night long, accompanied by the beating of drums. Like most primitive African tribes, the people of the Baroba tribe were very superstitious. By wearing fetishes on their bodies, they believed that they could be protected from wild animals and hostile tribes. They thought no sickness could overtake them, and they would be assured of long life. Babies and little children often had fetishes hung about their necks by their parents or grandparents. They also believed that certain fetishes assured them of a good crop of rice with a minimum amount of work, and there were more expensive fetishes that would enable them to have large families. Like the silversmiths of Ephesus, Acts 19, verses 24 and 25, the fetish priests of Africa depend on the superstition of the people for their livelihood. Our hearts were stirred when we saw the people of Gropaka given over almost entirely to idolatry and fetish worship. Surely we had come to the right place to preach the gospel. Each day we conducted a morning service at the mission. This was followed by 3 hours of school for the 40 to 50 boys and girls who had come to live on the compound, as was the custom in those days. Then each evening, as we were able, we conducted services in the middle of the town. A native preacher, Ernest Weah, who had served under other missionaries, acted as our interpreter. We also found some of the natives could understand Pidgin English. Later we acquired some of the Baroba language. We alluded frequently to fetish worship in our preaching, and tried to point out that Christ could deliver them from the fear of evil spirits and give them real peace in their hearts. Being very zealous for the Lord, we wanted to see the people quit their fetish worship and accept Christ at once. But our zeal was not tempered with knowledge. Finally, one evening, while preaching in the village, I pointed out to King Juhuli and his elders that it certainly did not look right for them to have a heathen fetish shrine at one entrance to their village and a mission station at the other. I proceeded to preach about Elijah on Mount Carmel and the priests of Baal. I quoted Elijah's words, "How long halt ye between 2 opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." 1 Kings 18:21. I told them how God sent fire down from heaven and consumed Elijah's sacrifice. We had previously told the story of how Jesus had cleansed the lepers, opened the eyes of the blind, and even raised the dead. And now our message was on Elijah calling down fire from heaven. 2 missionaries had laid down their lives in Gropaka while pioneering the gospel among these primitive people. So surely it was now time to ask for a showdown. Or was it? Show us God's power. When I had finished speaking, I asked the chief and his elders to give us their answer. Were they ready to renounce their fetish worship and follow the God who answers by fire and the Christ that we preached? Or should we consider going to another tribe with the gospel? My challenge was premature. As long as I live, I shall never forget the chief's reply. This is the essence of what he said. "White man, you have asked us to give up the religion of our ancestors for a new religion, one that has not been tried by our people. You tell us that your God has all power, that he can cleanse the leper, open the eyes of the blind, and raise the dead. You have just told us about Elijah's God sending down fire from heaven. But we've not seen any fire yet, nor any power of the God you talk about. Our fetish priests have performed miracles for many years, or so we believe. Our fathers died trusting in the power of fetishes. We are prepared to consider serving your God, but before doing so, we should like to see a demonstration of this power you talk about. There are many lepers in our village. Would you mind healing some of them?" The chief and 2 of his elders had leprosy. "There are many blind among us. Please heal some of these. And our people are dying every day." While the chief was speaking, his words were interrupted by the piercing wail of a mother whose baby had died in her arms. The other pagan women soon gathered in her hut and sympathetically began to wail with her. After all these years, we have sometimes awakened in the night and imagined we could hear that hopeless, helpless, Christless wail of the lost that we heard many times in those early years in Africa. The chief continued by saying that as soon as they saw some of the miracles of the Bible take place, they would seriously consider destroying the big fetish as I had suggested they do. So, instead of putting the people of Gropaka on the spot, we ourselves were put on the spot. How could we answer the chief? What could we tell the people? I had to confess that everything the chief said was logical. It was now time for us to practice what we preached. We returned home that night, wondering if we ought not to pack up and leave the country. I vowed I would never preach in town again until God did something for us. We lay on our faces before the Lord for days. We reminded the Lord of his promise in Mark 16:17. These signs shall follow them that believe. We said, Lord, if they are not to follow the missionaries who have obeyed your command to go to all the world, then who are they to follow? We fasted and prayed and asked the boys and girls on the mission station to join us in fasting and prayer one day a week for the outpouring of the Holy Ghost. As a result of getting the school children to seek the Lord, many of them were definitely saved, and some of them received the baptism in the Holy Spirit. We begin to see miracles. King Jufuli had sent one of his sons to the mission school. James was about 12 or 14 years of age, and he was almost blind from cataracts on his eyes. One morning in devotions, I read the story of how Jesus healed blind Bartimaeus, Mark chapter 10. James came forward for prayer. He asked me if I thought Jesus was able to heal his eyes. After what had taken place in town a few weeks before, I knew this was no time to hedge or beat about the bush. I told him that if he would completely surrender his whole life to God to do his will, that Jesus would heal him as he had Bartimaeus. He knelt down and cried out to God with all his might, I suppose much as blind Bartimaeus did at Jericho. When I knew James really meant business, I knelt down beside him and laid my hands upon his eyes. I asked God, for Jesus' sake, and for the sake of James's heathen father, and for the sake of the people of Gropaka who had asked to see a miracle of God's power, to please heal this boy. Suddenly James opened his eyes and looked up. I saw that the cataracts had completely disappeared. His face lit up, and without saying a word, he jumped to his feet, ran out the door of the chapel and all the way to town to his father's house to show him what God had done for him. Because he was the son of the chief, the news of his healing soon spread throughout the entire town of Gropaka. Saved from the dung heap. The leading hammock carrier in town, a strong, muscular man named Gredeji, had a wife who became very ill. She had not properly recovered from childbirth and steadily grew worse. She was also a leper. During our visits to town, we called repeatedly at the Gredeji hut to see this poor, emaciated, dying woman. Then one day we heard the familiar death wail that could be heard from town when the wind was right. One of the school children in our yard, understanding the wailing, told us that Gredeji's wife had died. The people of Gropaka did not bury their dead, but carried the corpses to a fetish grove on a little hilltop not far from town. There they were left for the hyenas, jackals, and vultures to devour. When the wind came from that direction, the odor of decaying human flesh was stifling and almost more than we could bear. After some months, we persuaded the chief and his elders to override the wishes of the fetish priests and break with the ancient custom of the fathers and bury their dead. When they finally did this, we felt it was quite an achievement. But now, Gredeji's poor wife was destined for the grove. Late in the afternoon, as was our custom, we walked into Gropaka, where the people, especially the children, always gathered around us. We decided to stop at Gredeji's hut to offer our condolences to him in his bereavement. A large group of people, mostly women, had gathered outside the hut and were weeping and wailing. We were rather surprised to see the naked woman lying on a refuse heap nearby. She had wasted away to mere skin and bone and looked like a skeleton before her death. As we looked at the body about to be taken to the fetish grove where all the dead were placed, I noticed a slight twitching of her muscles. I said to Gredeji, "You're not going to the grove yet, are you?" I noticed a slight movement in her body. He said, That doesn't mean anything. That will stop before we get to the grove. We could detect no heartbeat or other sign of life, and it seemed to us from the foul odor that decomposition had set in before death. As I looked at the corpse on the refuse heap and heard and saw the people weeping around it, I felt God suddenly speak to my heart. I heard him say, "This is the opportunity you've been waiting for. The people have been asking for a demonstration of the power of God. You pray for this woman, and I'll raise her up." But my reasoning said, "Oh, no, this is an impossible case. Let me pray for a person with some minor ailment." Then I realized that I couldn't heal anything, not even a mosquito. A God who can perform one miracle can perform all miracles, even to the raising of the dead. I told Ruth that God had told me to pray for the raising of this woman. I was afraid she would think I'd lost my mind, but she said, "If you feel this is the will of God, just go ahead and I'll stand with you." So, before Gredagy could carry his wife's body to the fetish grove, I said to him, "Are you satisfied that no fetish medicine or power on earth can raise this woman up?" He replied, "Of course there is no medicine strong enough to raise the dead." I was so sure that God had spoken to me that I sent for King Jufuli and some of his elders. When they came, I asked them the same question I had asked Gredagy. They made the same reply. Then I said, "We are going to pray and ask God to raise this woman up and heal her for his glory." We knelt beside the body on the dung heap and began to pray. I prayed a few words, telling the Lord we had come to Africa at his command. The heathen had asked for a demonstration of his power, which we felt was quite in order. And the quiet prayer under my breath was, "Dear Lord, your cause is at stake." Ruth and I laid hands on the body and rebuked death and the devil in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Instantly the body began to shake violently up and down on the ground. The body was lifted as a whole, so we could see between it and the ground under it. The people scattered in every direction. When the shaking ceased, the woman sat up, to the amazement of everybody. We told the people to praise God for this mighty manifestation of power in raising this woman from the dead. I told Gredagy to kill a chicken and have the women prepare some food for his wife to eat, and this they set about doing. Just as we were leaving Gropaka village for home, a runner met us with a letter from a missionary requesting that I come to Neyro at once, as her co-worker was dying of malaria fever and wanted me to be on hand to bury her. The co-worker, Miss Eustace, had laid out the dress she wanted to be buried in, and had given instructions to send certain keepsakes home to her mother in Richmond, Virginia. I took a kerosene lantern and a few mission boys and walked all night to the Neyro station. After much prayer and encouraging her to roll her burden on the Lord, Miss Eustace was able to be up and about in a few days. She served 3 or 4 terms after that, and 25 years later I visited her grave under a palm tree in Pan. On my way to Gropaka from Neyro, I was myself smitten with a severe case of malaria fever and sun fever, and was bedfast for many days. The miracle is confirmed. As soon as I was able to walk again, we resumed our regular schedule of visiting Gropaka town before sunset. One of the first places we visited was the home of hammock carrier Gredagy. When he appeared, I immediately asked about his wife's health. He smiled and said she was perfectly well and would soon be coming in from the rice farm where she had been working that day. I could hardly believe my ears. I said, "Look, Gredagy, you're a heathen man, and probably have a number of wives, as is the custom of your people. But I am speaking of the woman whose remains you were about to take to the fetish grove about 3 weeks ago, the woman we prayed for. Where is she?" "Master, that's the woman I'm talking about. Your God raised her from the dead, and here she comes now." We looked up, and here came a woman with a huge load of firewood on her head, and on top of it was a large stalk of bananas, a tremendous load for any woman to carry. When she had lowered the heavy load to the ground, I asked her name. She gave us the name of the woman the townspeople were wailing over a few weeks before. I asked her who had made her well. Her face lit up, and she pointed to the sky and said, "Naisoa," meaning God. Having myself just been healed of a terrible dose of sun fever and still rather shaky, I suppose I got a little excited. But I was so thrilled that I went to the center of town and began beating the large palaver drum. The people poured into town from every direction to find out what the palaver was. When they had gathered, I stood before them with the woman who had been raised from the dead. I asked the people whether they knew this woman. They admitted that they did. Then I asked them to tell me who it was that had restored this woman to life. And of course the voices cried out, "Naisoa! Naisoa!" Taking advantage of their response, I said, "Let us all give thanks to God for performing this miracle, proving that He has more power than all the fetishes in the world." So we had a great praise service right there in the middle of that heathen village. As a result of these miracles, there was a great outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the people of Gropaka that spread throughout much of Baroba. This was one of the greatest moves of God we have ever witnessed, either in Africa or in the United States. King Jufuli renounced fetish worship and accepted the Lord, as did most of the members of his council. He witnessed throughout his realm of how God had blessed the people of Gropaka after they gave up fetish worship and accepted Christ. Jufuli's son, James, received the Holy Spirit after his eyes were healed and continued his education at the Gropaka Mission School. As for Gredaji, he took a strong stand for the Lord after his wife was raised from the dead and witnessed to everyone far and near of what God had done. Chapter 6. Burning of the Big Fetish. For our God is a consuming fire. Hebrews 12, verse 29. The morning after our praise service in Gropaka, Jufuli and his elders paid a visit to the mission. We served them tea, as was the custom of the mission. Then the chief told us that he and his council of elders had discussed the recent miracle they had seen with their own eyes, and were now convinced they no longer needed the fetish shrine. The God of the missionaries was more powerful and able to protect them from all evil. They suggested that perhaps I would like to destroy the fetish at my convenience. The chief said that they themselves could not destroy it, for fear of reprisals from the fetish priests, but we had their permission to remove it whenever we wished to do so. They would prefer, however, that we wait a few days so the witch doctors would not suspect them of having asked us to do it. A few days later, with a group of our mission boys, we made our way to the big fetish. Using a bundle of split bamboo as a torch, we set fire to the shrine that had guarded the entrance to the village for so many years. As the fetish began to burn, many of the townspeople gathered around us. Some of the older ones called King Jufuli to the scene and told him to stop us, for they feared a great calamity would come to them if the fetish were destroyed. The king told them that if the fetish had any power at all, it could defend itself. This reminded us of what Gideon's father had said after Gideon had pulled down the altar of Baal and offered up a bullock to the Lord in its place. He said, "If Baal be God, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar." Judges 6, verse 31. Honey in the rock. Of course, the god made with human hands could not defend itself, so soon burned to the ground. The 2 beehive jars were filled with honey. After most of the bees had made their escape, our mission boys picked up the jars and started to eat some of the honey. Some of the natives told them that they would surely die because the honey was part of the fetish altar. But the boys told them the honey now belonged to the Lord, and they were not afraid of harm coming to them. Then they started to sing the old song we had taught them. "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. It tastes like honey in the rock." Many of the people had assembled to witness the destruction of the fetish, so we conducted a service in town. Our Christians gave testimony of what the Lord had done for them, including the king's son James, who had been healed of blindness. We felt led to dwell on the great love of God, in contrast to the religion of fear that had caused them to rely on fetishes for protection. When I asked how many wanted to discard their fetishes and follow the Lord, many of them removed the charms from their bodies and brought the idols and jujus from their homes and threw them in a heap in the middle of the circle. We then set fire to these and had a time of rejoicing. This reminded us of Paul's experience at Ephesus, as recorded in Acts 19, verses 18 and 19. "And many that believed came and confessed and showed their deeds. Many of them also which used curious arts brought their books together and burned them before all men." Following the burning of the fetishes, God visited us with an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and many accepted Christ as Lord of their lives. not only in Gropaka but in the surrounding Baroba villages. The people of Gropaka prospered as never before. I remember on one occasion many months later overhearing King Jufuli talking with the chief of another large village about fetish worship. Apparently the other chief still trusted in fetish medicine for protection. Jufuli told him that since the people of Gropaka had given up fetish worship and accepted the missionary as God, the Lord Jesus Christ, they were happier and more prosperous than they had ever been before. Blanche returns to the U.S. Though Blanche seemed to recover from her earlier attacks of malaria, it was not long until she began to suffer with repeated bouts of fever. They grew worse and worse as time went on. At times she would become quite delirious from running high temperatures. Finally, Ruth and I decided we should send her home in order to save her life. We knew of many others who had been compelled to leave the field after a few months, as did William Johnson after 7 months on the field his first term. But he was able to return to Liberia later for many years of successful ministry. So after seeing Blanche suffer much and grow weaker and weaker, we sent her home with Sophia Nygaard, who was returning to Canada for a well-earned furlough. I escorted the two women to the coast and saw them safely on a boat for England in February 1922. After recuperating there for a time, Blanche was able to continue her journey home to America. She later married Ruth's brother, Alfred Trotter, and they came to Liberia together. Another miracle. African Christians, like their brothers anywhere in the world, have their severe tests. Tragically, some of them fall by the way. But having once cut loose from pagan customs and having taken the stand of the Christian, the African is not fully accepted back into pagan society even if he does backslide. A backslidden African Christian is indeed an outcast from both the pagan and the Christian society. He goes off by himself and establishes a home in a new location, usually some distance from both the native town and the mission station. Philip was one of these unfortunates. He came to our station at Gropaka one day when I was away on trek and introduced himself to Ruth. She describes what happened. He confessed his backsliding and asked if he could please bring his dying wife to the station so that when she died she could be buried in the mission cemetery. Of course I said yes. I offered him my hammock so that she could be brought in with some degree of primitive comfort. He thanked me, took the hammock, and left. A few days later in the afternoon I heard a commotion in the yard, and there was Philip with quite a crowd. In the hammock lay Alice, unconscious and shriveled to a skeleton. The crowd was made up of a number of people from each village they had passed through, who were following to see what the outcome would be. We took her down to the house of some of our native workers, Lloyd and Martha, where I had engaged a room for her. We spread a blanket over the grass mat and gently laid her down. It looked so hopeless, but I felt an urge to pray for her. I told the native worker to tell all the people to leave the room. A group of Christians knelt with me to pray after we had closed the door. Here was a woman who needed God for her body. I explained to the others how I felt, and we prayed that God would raise her up, not for her sake alone, but for a testimony to all the people who knew of her case. We asked God to show them He cares for them and loves them and wants to save them. There was no special manifestation, but there was peace in all our hearts. An hour or so later I went down with a cup of hot tea and a small dish of custard. Alice was barely conscious. We fed her and prayed again. The next day had its load of responsibilities, and I didn't get to see Alice at all. Martha was looking after her and reporting that she was improving. We supplied what food we could for her and quinine for the malaria. One morning when I was in the kitchen telling the houseboy what to fix for the next meal, a woman appeared in the doorway with a loaded cane jar on her head. In it were several pounds of rice, a cluster of palm nuts, and a stalk of bananas. The load must have weighed 35 pounds. She said, "Good morning, Ma." I answered, "Good morning. What can I do for you?" Her face broke into a radiant smile as she said, "You don't know me, do you? I'm Alice, and I'm going home." I could hardly believe my senses. Here she was, straight and tall, with a load on her head, a staff in her hand, smilingly announcing that she was off on a 15-mile hike for home, after she had been carried in unconscious just 4 days before, with no human hope for recovery. The good news spread far and wide, and there was much rejoicing among Christians and pagans as well. Chapter 7. Settling among the cannibals. I, being in the way, the Lord led me. Genesis 24, verse 27. John, Yetta, and Timothy, native workers who had accompanied us on our first trip to the Pond tribe, spent several months among the Pond people in Rodilly, the village that William Johnson and I had visited in 1921. When they returned with their families to Baroba later in the year to attend the annual Christmas convention, who should accompany them but King Tho of Rodilly? John and Timothy had done a good work in Pond to cause King Tho to want to come with them. But you never saw a king so regally clad. He had on an old black silk top hat, which had turned shades of purple and green from age, and a short, tight-fitting green cricket coat that someone in England had given us to give to a native. One of the workers had carried it back to Pond with him on one of his trips. The rest of Tho's attire was an old red and white striped dish towel tied around his loins. He was bare from there down. King Tho liked all he had observed about Christianity during the time John and Timothy had been living in his village, and he accepted all he understood. But on one occasion he said to me, "This story of Jesus, did your father know this story?" "Yes," I replied. "And his father, did he also know this story?" "Yes, he did." "Then why did not your father or his father come to tell my fathers the story?" he asked. "I am now too old to fully understand it, but I want you to tell the story to my people." In spite of his apparel, Tho's royalty showed through clearly in his dignified bearing. He was a king. He knew it, and all who met him recognized it. He told us he had come down to get a missionary for his tribe. We told him he would have to make his appeal to the committee at the Blebo convention. Shortly afterward, when all the missionaries, native pastors and workers, and many Christians had gathered at Blebo for the annual meeting, a long line of chiefs came before the field committee to plead for a missionary, a native pastor, or a Christian lay worker to settle in their town. But sad to say, the committee was not able to promise any of the chiefs to any workers at all. One missionary had just died, and 3 others had been sent home ill in an effort to save their lives. Each of the others left on the field was already loaded with more responsibility than he could successfully handle. A king's persistence. King Tho said he would wait, and wait he did. He returned with us to our station at Gropaka. We had told him at his first request that we could not leave Gropaka, but when King Tho came to get a missionary, he had no intention of leaving without one. Each morning he came up on the front porch, knocked on the door, and asked, "Puikali, are you ready to go with me today?" Each time we told him no, he would walk off the porch and through the yard, giving out a long, drawn-out, heartbreaking wail of hopelessness. One day he told us, "I can't go home without you. My people instructed me to bring home a missionary, and if I come home alone, they will kill me. I can't go home without you." He came every morning for more than a month with the same plea. He meant to have a missionary, and he would not leave without one. We could not help but contrast his daily plea for a missionary with his attitude the first time we had seen him over a year ago. Then he had told us we could sleep in the bush with the monkeys. But how much longer could we endure this pleading and the wailing that followed? We prayed much and finally felt that God must be trying to tell us that we were more needed in Pan than in Baroba. After conferring with the missionaries on the other stations, it was agreed that the 2 lady missionaries at Nainabo could separate, one remaining on the station there, and the other coming to Gropaka to carry on in our place until the new recruits expected in a few months would arrive. So we immediately began plans for moving to Rodilly. When we told King Tho one morning that we would go with him, his joy knew no bounds. He sent word home for porters to come and carry our hammocks and headloads, and for them to build us a house to live in when we got there. We had asked the Gropaka people to supply us with porters, but they refused. They said they would carry missionaries into their village, but they would never carry them out to any other tribe. Eventually, the Pond men arrived, about 50 of them. Ethel Benjamin, a Canadian missionary who had been on the field for a number of years and who had been burdened for Pond for a long time, wanted to go with us. When she had made satisfactory arrangements for other missionaries at Newaka Station to take over her responsibilities, it was agreed she should accompany us. The long trek. So the big day came, and we started on a long, arduous trek through dense jungle. The forest foliage was so heavy the sun never got through. The undergrowth, a tangled web of vines, creeping plants, ferns, moss, and parasitic vegetation, at times was as impenetrable as a solid wall. There were sections of the jungle where the porters had to put down their loads and hack a tunnel through the heavy growth. We would crawl through on our hands and knees, and the porters would drag their loads after them until we reached a place where we could stand upright. We spent each night in a native village, our presence creating quite a stir. In those days, many of the tribes in the interior of Liberia had not been brought under the control of the national government, but were a law unto themselves. The Liberian Army Frontier Force occasionally made forays into this wild country in the hope of subduing the people. And in the interim, since our first visit to the Pond tribe, such an expedition had run into real trouble. It seems that some government officials, hearing that we missionaries had made a trip deep into the interior, decided they could successfully send soldiers in to represent law and order. In a tribe bordering on the Pond territory, a large village had been burned by the government soldiers simply because the natives did not submit to their first demands. But the tribal warriors had succeeded in capturing the commander of the frontier force, and while the town was still burning, the men and women of the village gathered around him. According to the testimony of these people themselves, they proceeded to cut pieces from his body while he was still alive, roast them in the embers of the smoldering town, and eat them before his eyes. When we reached this same village a few months later on our trip to move to Pond, they had rebuilt the town and made a new stockade around it. At the main entrance, which was well guarded by spearmen, they had hung the bones of the commander they had eaten on a crossbeam over the gateway. After being convinced by our porters that we did not represent the government but were missionaries, they allowed us to enter the village. We were told that the village chief or king was wearing around his neck a snuff box made from one of the dried ears of the army officer. I took a picture of Ruth standing beside this warrior chief. We had some misgivings about spending the night in this cannibal village, but as the sun had already set and we were miles from any other village, we could do nothing else. Our new mud home. Finally, we reached Rodelli. The little 3-room mud house with a grass roof was far from comfortable. Soon the rainy season was upon us, and the roof was not thick enough to shed the torrential rain. The water came into the house and ran down the walls and across the mud floor in rivulets. The house had to be re-roofed repeatedly until at last there was enough leaf on it to keep the rain from coming through. The native women would come again and again to beat the floors when wide cracks appeared as the mud dried out. They would sprinkle a portion of the floor with water, then pound it with a heavy, crooked club shaped for the purpose. The group worked in unison, keeping rhythm by singing or chanting a work melody. We were always besieged by children and young men trying to figure out our way of doing things. Our old-fashioned wood-burning stove was a novelty to them, as Pond women always cooked in a heavy iron pot placed on 3 large stones around an open bonfire either inside or outside the house. Our bed was another novelty. One young man, Kaide, seemed underfoot all the time. He was anxious to learn and picked up enough West African pidgin English for us to communicate with him, though laboriously. Before leaving Gropaka, we had been warned by government officials and Baroba chiefs that the people of Pond were cannibals. On arriving at Rodelli, we hardly knew what to expect. After a few weeks, during which there were no wars or fighting, and we had seen no real evidence of cannibalism, we began to wonder if they really were cannibals after all. Since Kaide seemed so open and friendly, Ruth decided to ask him outright about the matter. Kaide was a typical pond man of warrior age. He wore no shirt or trousers or shoes, only a loincloth made of bark beaten into a pliable piece like very rough burlap. His head reminded us of a much-used mop. It was covered with tiny pigtails. There must have been at least 100, probably more. His hair had been oiled with palm oil, and then the finished coiffure treated with cow dung, which killed the lice, a very common affliction. Watching for her chance one day, Ruth approached the issue of cannibalism and began to talk with him. Country fashion. Ruth said, "Kaide, I be stranger for your country, and I no savvy all your country fashion. You fit to help me learn your country fashion?" "I fit," he replied. "Before I come for this town, I hear long time how pond people you eat somebody. It be true pond people eat somebody?" He didn't answer her, but spent several minutes studying her face to determine whether she was trying to trap him or intended to ridicule him. After waiting a few minutes, Ruth said, "Kaide, it no be palaver. We come to pond to help pond people. Every people got different fashion. I only want to know how your country fashion be. Maybe I know here true, I be stranger. You be friend for mission, so I ask you, it be true, it no be true? Pond people eat somebody?" When he recognized she was truly serious and sympathetic, he answered, "It be true, we eat somebody." "You yourself, Kaide, you ever eat somebody?" He replied, "I eat plenty people." "Who you eat?" Ruth asked. "When we got some war, this side," throwing out his right arm, "fight this side," throwing out his left arm. "We catch somebody from other side and chop him." He finished with a flourish. Chop was the common word meaning to eat. "Oh, I see," Ruth responded. "Then some day you go vex for me, and then you go chop me?" "Oh, no, madam, you be white man," he exclaimed. Subsequent experience taught us that cannibalism really was practiced in that tribe. Kaide was one of the young men who accompanied me on the trek to rescue little Jitue a few weeks later, so he was well aware of the seriousness of my predicament when trying to negotiate for Jitue's release. Soon after reaching Rodilly, we were stricken with malaria and were shut off from any contact with our missionary friends near the coast. We did not know the language of these primitive people, and mostly they knew not a word of English, so it was very difficult to communicate with them. But with the help of the Lord and 2 faithful godly workers from Baroba, we managed to sow some seed that eventually bore fruit that remains until now. Chapter 8. Gita, the Sacred Mountain. I was not disobedient unto the heavenly vision. Acts 26, verse 19. We found the people of the Pond tribe, much like the Barobas, very superstitious and given to fetish worship. Like the people of Baroba, they wore fetish charms on their bodies and used them on and in their homes. However, the Pond tribe had one big fetish above all, Gita, a sacred mountain. The stories we heard about Gita were fantastic. They believed it was the home of ancestral spirits which were now under the control of Satan himself. When any of their people died, their spirits were believed to go immediately to live at the sacred mountain. As these spirits were received, the mountain became covered with clouds of smoke. On moonlit nights, the people would sing and dance to the beating of drums as they called out the name of Geta, spelled Geta, and went through peculiar contortions and gesticulations. They made sacrifices to Geta by placing food in containers on the outskirts of town. In the morning, when the food was gone, they believed the spirits had come and carried it away. We inquired whether anyone had ever attempted to climb the mountain to visit with the ancestors. One old man told us that long, long ago some foolish people had ventured too near the mountain, and Geta sent out fire and burned them up. Others who had strayed a bit too close heard rumblings of warning and fled for their lives. Some reported seeing footprints made by Satan and his followers. After hearing these fantastic stories about the mountain, I became quite eager to climb it to prove to the people that there was nothing to all these superstitious tales. However, since these people were easily excited and seemed ready to fight on the slightest pretext, I knew I would have to broach the subject to King Tho with caution. Anything which threatened their traditions was extremely dangerous. This was fresh on my mind because of something that had happened not long before. Before we came, our native workers had established a small school on the mission site and had admitted some boys from Rodilly. After we arrived, John Yedda told us that one of the boys had run away. He asked me to go to town with him to inquire into the matter. We had barely started to discuss the case with the elders of Rodilly, whom we considered our friends, when suddenly, without warning, they became very angry. Seizing their cutlasses and spears, they surrounded us and threatened to kill us. They were so enraged it was impossible to reason with them. We silently prayed and eventually managed to walk quietly away from them without receiving bodily harm. An excerpt from an old diary reads, "This was our first time to be surrounded by a group of angry cannibals, but God delivered." That same evening, King Tho and his elders came and begged us to overlook what they had done in their anger. They brought a white fowl, and after cutting its throat, sprinkled some of its blood on us and on themselves. This, they said, was to be a blood covenant between us. They were never to shed our blood, nor we ever to shed their blood. This covenant was to be extended to include other Rodilly people in the future, and any other missionaries who might come to live among them. I also recorded in my diary the following: "This covenant affects only the town of Rodilly, and not the whole Pond tribe." We never did know why the boy ran away, nor why the townspeople got so angry, but it taught us these people could get very angry and start a big fight over the merest trifle. Our subsequent experiences with them confirmed this point. Climbing Geta. At first, King Tho seemed shocked that I should even suggest climbing the mountain, and warned me of the dangers involved. Finally, after we had lived among them for a time, he reluctantly consented for me to make the ascent, if I promised not to shoot at Geta, nor to disturb the spirits of the departed. On the other hand, I must accept all responsibility for what might happen to me and my party. Geta might become angry and send out fire to consume us. Early one morning, accompanied by John Yedda, a few of the mission boys, and about 5 Pond warriors from Rodilly, I headed for the sacred mountain. The small town of Mobili was closer to Geta, so we decided to enter the jungle from that point. We had not gone far before the young warriors from Rodilly began to call out, "Geta, our god, do not be angry with us. The white man does not bring war or trouble, but is just coming to visit you. Please do not harm us." Meanwhile, they bit off pieces of kola nut and spit on the ground, while they made certain gestures with their hands. As we got closer to the face of the mountain, the jungle became so thick we had to cut our way through foot by foot. Soon the warriors stopped, saying, "This is far enough for us." They urged us to turn back also before it was too late. I thanked them for their help thus far and suggested they return to Mobili and wait for us there. The Heavenly Vision. We cut our way step by step until we reached the base of the mountain. On the side facing us was a perpendicular cliff which looked almost as if it had been sliced off with a big knife. As we stood there looking for a possible route to the summit, I was suddenly transfixed in my tracks. I recognized the place. There was an overpowering feeling I had seen this place before. I said to John Yedda, "John, we've seen this mountain before." He looked at me in amazement as if I'd suddenly gone mad or been smitten delirious with an attack of malaria fever. He reminded me where we were, and that we were the first people to ever visit the place, or at least as far back as any of the Pond people could remember. Then the truth dawned on me, and I told John the story. As already recounted, I had received a call to Africa while a student at Beulah Heights Missionary and Bible Training School at North Bergen, New Jersey. During an intercessory prayer hour one day, there seemed to appear before me a mountain on which a large number of black people standing overlooking a precipice. Among them I saw a horrible-looking creature that I at once took to be the devil. With a look of fiendish glee, he seized these poor people one by one and threw them over the precipice. As I looked, I began to weep, and I prayed, "Dear Lord, isn't there someone to warn them to get back and escape the clutches of this terrible creature?" The answer came back to me, "There is no one to tell them. Will you go?" I replied, "Yes, Lord, I'll be glad to go if you will tell me where." It was shortly after this experience that William Johnson from Liberia had visited the school and told of tribes in Liberia's interior that had never once heard the gospel. I had responded, and God had brought me this far. Now here I was, looking at the very mountain God had shown me in a vision a few years before. It seemed incredible. I almost collapsed with physical weakness, and my spiritual alarm bells were ringing. Were we on the devil's territory? Did he really live here? And was the mountain inhabited by evil spirits? Since coming to Africa, I had sometimes already felt the powers of darkness so strongly that it seemed one could cut them with a knife. But this was a new and even more intense experience. Then it seemed the Lord made it all clear to me. The devil did not only live at Mount Gita, but as a roaring lion he went about everywhere, seeking whom he might devour. He was taking advantage of the superstitious fears of these primitive people for whom Christ died. With a sense of God's presence, we made our way to the top of the mountain, where we sang some hymns together. I thanked God for bringing us safely to the very place of my vision. We prayed that God would help us reach the pond people for Him. After picking up some sample pieces of minerals, which were plentiful on the mountain, we returned to Mobile. We found the men we had left behind and most of the townspeople standing outside the village, watching to see what would become of us. When we returned safely, some said we could not have reached the mountain or we would have been killed. Others said the devil was afraid of the white man and had either hid or run away. But those with us insisted we had reached the summit and produced pieces of ore to prove it. Then our testimony was generally accepted by the people of Mobile and Rodeli. The people, especially the young, said, "We will now listen to the message of the white man instead of the stories handed to us by our forefathers." The news spread far and wide, even to other tribes who regarded Geta as the strongest fetish in the whole country. So wherever we went after that, we had no difficulty in getting an audience. Little by little, the power of fetish worship was broken. Today, there are spirit-filled preachers and congregations among the Pan people. Mount Geta 30 years later. In 1951, R.G. Letourneau visited Liberia in the interest of securing iron ore for the manufacture of his big earth-moving machines. The mission had made an airstrip near the base of the sacred mountain, not far from the site of our first mission station. A small missions airplane with a pilot was placed at the disposal of Mr. Letourneau and his geologists and engineers while they analyzed the mineral content of Geta. They found the mountain very rich in minerals, including iron, tin, manganese, gold, and other material. It is believed it was at one time an active volcano, which could account for the stories about smoke having been seen on its summit in days gone by. When we had lived at Pan in the time of our story, we had noticed that there were native blacksmiths who made their own iron in crude smelters and beat it into implements such as spears, cutlasses, arrows, knives, axes, and hoes. This seemed to be the only tribe in the interior able to do this. Cut off from the outside world, they managed to survive without importing modern tools. Letourneau's men asked some of the old Pan men what they did for lime in their smelters. They reluctantly admitted that they had used human bones for this purpose. This may have been one reason for the practice of cannibalism in earlier days. Chapter 9. The Rescue. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him and delivereth them. Psalm 34, verse 7. It was March 1922. We had been among the Pan people not quite 2 months. A small group of native Christians whom we had brought with us from Baroba were returning from a preaching trip to some nearby villages when they nearly stumbled over a woman's body lying beside the trail just outside the native village. The Christians carried her almost lifeless form to our mission, where she was prayed for and cared for until she revived sufficiently to tell her story. She was a native of the Kru tribe, spelled K-R-U. The Kru tribe on the Liberian coast. Her name was Jetu. Misfortune had overtaken her there when her firstborn son, about 5 years old, was kidnapped and killed one night by witch doctors. The cannibals ate the boy, and portions of his body were used in making fetish medicine. Jetu's next child was a girl, born in 1911. During a time of famine, fearful lest some harm befall her little one, Jetu took the little girl and ran away from her husband one night and started for the interior. For several days she followed groups of travelers until she felt sure she had outdistanced the evil spirits that might have caused the death of her firstborn. In the strange land of the interior, she sought food and shelter for herself and her child. Finally, an elder in the council of one of the Pan chiefs offered to lend her enough seed rice to sow a small field if she would turn the child over to him for security. An agreement was made that as soon as harvest was over, Jetu would return the seed rice with interest and receive her little one back again. However, when harvest time came, the crafty old African refused to return the child, knowing he could either add her to his already large harem or sell her for a good price to someone else. Jetu begged and pleaded in vain for the release of her child. One night she managed to rescue her girl and started out on the long journey back to the coast. It was not long before she was overtaken by a band of natives sent after her by the elder, who beat her severely and took the child from her. 3 times she made the same attempt with the same results. Discouraged, Jetu joined the harem of a Pan native and later became the mother of a baby boy, Bamwe. She soon took to wandering about again and contracted an incurable disease which left her in a weakened condition. No one wanted her, so she was driven from one village to another until, at the village near where our Christians had found her, her baby boy was taken from her and she was thrown out for the wild animals to devour. This would save them the trouble of burying a foreigner. One of our native preachers was a Kru man who recognized Jetu's tribal markings, and he talked to her about the Lord in her mother tongue. He warned her that she was facing eternity without God, and urged her to repent and surrender her remaining days to God. With diseased body and sin-burdened soul, she surrendered to the Lord and was gloriously saved. So our first convert in Pan was a Kru woman from a coastal tribe. Shortly after her conversion, Jetu sent for us and pleaded with us to rescue her 2 children. She said she wanted them to grow up in the mission and serve the same Christ that she had found. We succeeded without much difficulty in getting her boy, Bamwe, returned to her, since we were acquainted with the chief of the village where he had been taken. However, the rescue of the little girl was quite a different story. We told Jetu it would be almost impossible to rescue her daughter, as she was held captive in a village 3 or 4 days' journey from our mission, which was under the supervision of a different paramount chief. This chief and his people had lately been at war with our section of the tribe, a situation which had resulted in much bloodshed and ill feelings. The people of this village had never seen a white man nor come in contact with outside civilization. Knowing they were suspicious of strangers, we hesitated to go among them on such an errand. But Jetu would not take no for an answer. Her lament was always the same. "Oh, if I could only see my daughter again before I die." After days of listening to her pitiful pleading, we decided to do what we could to fulfill her wish. I knew her time on earth was short. After much prayer and deliberation, I organized a group of natives to go with me on this errand of mercy. Meanwhile, Mrs. Garlock, Ethel Bingaman, and the native Christians at the mission were much in prayer that God would prosper our journey. Our little caravan set out one morning just before dawn. Fortunately, some of the young men from our village who had been persuaded to accompany us had previously seen Jetu's little girl, Jitue, and would be able to identify her when we reached the village of her captors. The trail was long and difficult. At times it became necessary for us to skirt certain villages because of the recent hostilities. We entered other towns between rows of warriors whose spears were raised in a menacing manner, but God was with us. On the 3rd day of our long march, I was stricken down with fever in the middle of the dense forest. Our drinking water was spent, and my tongue became swollen and my lips parched. My temperature was high, but we went on until I finally fell exhausted by the side of the trail and soon lost consciousness. My faithful African pastor, John Yedde, who accompanied me on this trip, had seen other missionaries die. He thought my time had come. He and the other Christians in our party gathered around me and prayed desperately for me. We were miles from any village. It appeared that my name would be added to the long list of those who had died trying to open up a primitive part of Africa to the gospel. At this same time, my father, living in South Norwalk, Connecticut, was awakened from sleep in the middle of the night with a burden to pray for me. God gave him a vision of me lying there in the African jungle burning up with tropical fever. He knelt beside his bed that cold March night in Connecticut and prayed and interceded long for me until he felt the assurance that God had answered prayer. In fact, he saw me rise from the path and struggle on. How long I lay beside the trail I do not know, but to the amazement of those who traveled with me, I suddenly regained consciousness and was able to continue my journey. God gave me supernatural strength for the ordeal that lay ahead in the rescue of little Jitue. Months later, we received a letter from my father telling of his unusual experience. Upon comparing notes, we found, allowing for the difference in time on the two continents, that it was exactly the same time that I had been stricken with fever. God heard Father's prayer and raised me up to continue on my way. I am confident that I am alive today and that my ministry has been extended an additional 50 years as a result of the intercessory prayers of my dear old dad. He has been dead for many years, but being dead, he still speaks through his son and through the many souls who have been won during these 50 years. Jitue is found. As we approached the village where Jetu's daughter was captive, we prayed that God would go before us and work things out for our good and his glory. On entering the village, one of my carriers spied Jitue playing with some other children. Without being noticed by anyone in the village, he pointed her out to me. We proceeded directly to the home of the chief. It was quickly noised abroad that a strange party of travelers had arrived, and a crowd soon gathered. After exchanging the customary greetings, which are long and very ceremonious in Africa, we assured the chief that we had come peaceably. However, we were watched with great suspicion. I noticed that almost everyone was armed with a weapon of some kind. Knowing that there was more or less a state of war existing between these people and those in our section of the tribe, we felt it would be safer to spend the night elsewhere. So I told the chief that my visit would be brief this time, but that I hoped to return in the near future and tell him and his people more about the good news of salvation. Praying for wisdom and trying to be tactful and diplomatic, I began by inquiring whether any of them happened to know a wandering Kru woman by the name of Jetu. They all looked blank and denied having ever heard of such a person. I continued by telling them that Jetu was at our mission station in a dying condition and was begging to see her little girl before she died. I told them I had promised the dying woman to do my best to find the child, and hearing that she was in their village, had come to seek their help. I appealed to the kind-heartedness of the chief, and suggested that I knew that he, like myself, would be deeply touched by the dying mother's plea. Reluctantly, the chief admitted that he had known the woman. Her child had been in the village, but had left a few days before with another woman for parts unknown. Otherwise, he said, he would have been only too happy to send the child to see her mother. Then I told him I knew that Jetu's daughter was still in his village and pointed her out to him. The people looked at me in amazement, and one said, "The white man has plenty of sense." Fearing that they might whisk the little girl away and that we would never see her again, I suggested that they bring her to the palaver circle where we were gathered. This they reluctantly did. When she arrived, I smiled and asked if she would like to see her mother. Her big brown eyes looked up at me and seemed to say, "Oh, I surely would." I felt then and there that I could not leave without her. I asked the chief to allow her to go with us to see her mother, or if he wished, he might send along one of his trusted servants to look after her. I had a feeling that if we could once get her to the mission station, some way would be provided to effect her release. My request was denied. I asked the chief if he himself would accept an invitation to return with us for a royal visit to our mission and bring the child along with him. This proposal was also turned down. Then I offered to redeem the child by paying to the man who claimed to own her the price of a full-grown woman. When this was refused, I offered to pay the price of 2 women and then 3, feeling that no price was too great to pay if only Jetu could see her daughter once again and know that she was safe in the mission before she died. After talking the palaver, which lasted for several hours, without success, I acted somewhat impulsively. I told them that owing to the lateness of the hour, I would have to leave. Because they did not see fit to accept any of my proposals, I would just take the child with me and be gone. Then, if they wished, they could follow me in a few days to our station, where the matter would be discussed further. So saying, I handed the little girl to one of my carriers, bade the chief and his elders farewell, and quickly left the village. The people parted and made a way for us through their midst, but immediately showed their displeasure by the customary grinding of their teeth. We were hoping for the best, and I was hardly prepared for the worst. Eager to put as much distance as possible between us and the village, and hoping to reach home before Jetu died, we managed to make 3 towns before sundown. Arriving at the 3rd town, we asked the chief for a place to stay for the night. He gave us a large hut overlooking the village courtyard, where all trials were held and all palavers discussed. We conducted a little service and brought the townspeople the first gospel message they had ever heard. God's protection. After the service was over, the chief instructed his head wife to prepare a tasty meal for his guest, the white man. Shortly she appeared with a calabash of cooked rice and an earthen bowl of rat soup cooked with palm nuts. The woman tasted the rice and soup in our presence to prove that the food had not been poisoned. The carrion rat meat made it taste like poison to us, but the abundance of red pepper used in its preparation helped to cover a multitude of sins. It was said that if the guest of a chief in that tribe refused to eat the food set before him, the woman who prepared it would be killed as a witch. Therefore, to save the poor woman's life, we prayed, "Dear Lord, sanctify the food, and please don't let it kill us." It didn't. It was customary for our carriers, when on trek, to spend the night scattered about in various huts throughout the village. But that night all of them were very anxious to stay in the same hut with me. After committing ourselves to God's watchful care, we turned in for the night. About midnight I was suddenly awakened by the sound of tom-toms and blood-curdling screams. I immediately rose from my cot and looked through the only opening in the hut, a small doorway, facing in the direction from which we had come earlier in the evening. To my consternation, I saw a mass of black humanity pouring through the north gate of the village, screaming and yelling at the tops of their voices. Each one carried a weapon, and I heard them shouting, "Where is the white man? We have come to kill the white man. We know he is in your town, and if you don't tell us where he is, we'll burn your town to the ground." I saw one of the frightened townspeople point to the hut where we were staying. That was all the signal they needed. They made a mad rush in our direction. Their wild cries awakened John Yedda and the rest of the party. I can almost see dear old John yet as he came over to the opening and knelt beside me. "Look at them," he said. "Did you ever see such wild people? Do you hear what they are saying?" "Yes," I assured him. "I hear altogether too well." As we watched, they halted in the middle of the open space before us, where there were several human skulls, an elephant skull, and a large rock which was used by the people of the village for a whetstone for sharpening their hunting and farm implements. We saw these men sharpen their weapons and take an oath, the strongest oath in the tribe, which oath included drinking their own urine from the hand, that they would neither eat nor sleep until they had killed and feasted upon the white man. John turned to me with tears in his eyes, saying, "Mr. Garlock, what shall we do?" I replied that there was only one thing we could do, and that was pray. And pray we did. Our little band poured out their hearts to God in earnest supplication. We certainly did not search for flowery words, but cried out to God to have mercy upon us and help us. That little hut became the gateway to heaven that night. I remember asking the Lord to forgive me where I had blundered and done the wrong thing, to overlook my ignorance and help us out of our predicament. I reminded the Lord that we had come, we believed, in His will to answer to a dying woman's prayer, and that my wife and the other Christians were praying for the success of our trip and would never know what happened to us if we fell into the hands of the bloodthirsty mob. The angel of the Lord. Then the scripture in Psalm 34, verse 7 came to me. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him, and delivereth them. While in prayer, I felt impressed to go outside the hut and face the angry mob. I told John how I felt. He begged me to stay inside and offered to go himself and try to appease the infuriated mob. He said if they killed him it didn't matter, but I must not go, and this brave man meant it with all his heart. I told John, it is I they want, not you. You just continue to hold on to God in prayer. I stepped out into the opening. Jitway and all my porters stayed hidden inside the hut, frightened almost to death. John came to the doorway to try to help me with the language. It was a beautiful moonlit night, and I was quickly observed. The mob rushed forward and soon surrounded the hut. I tried to talk and reason with them, but it was useless. They had been drinking palm wine and had worked themselves into an angry frenzy. As was the custom, these men had each of their front teeth filed to a sharp point, and their hair braided into long, woolly pigtails. Their faces were painted with war paint, and their quivering bodies were greased with palm oil. Their long knives and cutlasses gleamed in the moonlight. When I saw they were too wild to listen to reason, I said as calmly as I could, "You have taken your vows and made your threats, but I am trusting in my God to protect me." They made a mad rush toward me with drawn knives, shouting, "Kill him! Kill him!" The leader rushed at me with his cutlass raised to behead me. When it seemed the end had come and my head was about to be severed from my body, I closed my eyes and committed myself to God, repeating over and over again that one name that is above every name. Jesus! Jesus! Suddenly there was a death-like stillness. The tom-toms stopped beating, and all screaming and yelling halted abruptly. The silence could almost be felt. After what seemed like hours, I cautiously opened my eyes and wondered if I could believe them. Before me stood some of the savages with their weapons upraised, ready to strike, while others held drawn knives by their sides. But all were frozen in their tracks, including my would-be executioner. The God that had closed the lions' mouths in Daniel's time had held these wild, angry cannibals at bay. God had done what reasoning and persuasion could not do. The palaver settled. Too spellbound to move, I waited breathlessly to see what would happen next. Presently they began to relax, slowly backing up, and withdrew to the center of the village around the great rock where they held a hurried consultation. After some discussion, the leader came toward me, bowing to the ground at intervals as he came. I was still standing in front of the hut as though in a dream. This man seized me by the ankles and began to plead with me to have mercy on him and his men and spare their lives. "We see that the white man's God fights for him," he said. "If you will forgive us, we will accept your terms for settling the palaver." I told them we wished them no harm. Since they were ready to come to terms, we would be glad to pay them the price of little Jitway's redemption, so that she might be free to return to her dying mother. They readily agreed, so we measured out to them several yards of blue trading cloth, a supply of salt, and other commodities amounting to the price of a full-grown Pan woman. In addition to this, I gave them a blanket for their chief and some trinkets for the young men who would be carrying the loads back to the village. After accepting the goods, for which they thanked me, an order was given by their leader. They resumed the beating of the tom-toms, and with a mad rush disappeared into the African night. It was not until the noise of yelling and drumming had died away in the distance that I fully realized what had happened. I still do not know what they saw that night, but I have often wondered if they saw the angel of the Lord, as mentioned in Psalm 34, verse 7. Or perhaps, like Elisha's servant of old, they saw the horses and chariots of fire encircling our little company. One thing is certain, they did feel and see something that caused them to know that God was there protecting his servants. God had performed a miracle before our very eyes. There was no more sleep for any of our little party that night, for we spent the rest of the time until morning praising and thanking God for his marvelous deliverance. At break of day we continued our journey homeward. A few days later there was a great rejoicing at the mission when Jetu and little Jetue were reunited. That very night Jetu died, but God had mercifully spared her life to see the liberation of her child. On our way home to the mission station, I gave Jetue the English name of Ruth after my wife. She was approximately 11 years old at the time. We pried the heavy brass ring denoting slavery off little Ruthie's neck, and Mrs. Garlock began immediately to make her some pretty little dresses as she became one of the family. She learned how to read and write and to do small chores around the house. At an early age she gave her heart to the Lord. How her face used to shine as she testified in the service of how Jesus had saved her soul. She called us father and mother, and was Mrs. Garlock's shadow almost day and night. Chapter 10. A King's Life is Saved. For the dark places of the earth are full of the habitations of cruelty. Psalm 74, verse 20. One morning in April 1922, an excited, perspiring African runner came bounding up the path to our mission station. He was probably in his early teens. His hair was in long braided pigtails resembling a dust mop. His front teeth were filed to a point, and he was completely naked. I could see by the terror-stricken look on his face that something was terribly wrong. "Quickali! Quickali!" he shouted. "Come quickly! They are about to kill your friend, King Carlo. You must try to save him." King Carlo was the chief of a nearby village. We had visited his village a few times on preaching trips, and he had listened attentively to the story of salvation. He was a good friend of King Tho and frequently visited Rodilli, but now he was in trouble. His brother, a very old man, had died a few days previously, and the tribe's people were accusing the chief of killing him. In this tribe it was believed that no one ever died of natural causes, but as a result of witchcraft or the evil eye. As soon as word got out that the old man had died, everyone in the community exceeded himself in expressing grief, even to rubbing red pepper in his eyes. They did this to divert suspicion from themselves. This mourning and wailing and the screams of grief would sometimes keep up for many days and nights until the witch doctor chose a victim to be tried by the ordeal of the poison cup. In those days it was estimated by some authorities on Africa that no less than 4 million natives were killed annually in this manner on the continent of Africa. The poisoned cup. After several days of witch hunting, the powerful witch doctor had named the paramount chief, King Carlo, as a suspect. Believing in the infallibility of the witch doctor, Carlo's own sons and family people had resorted to torturing him, hoping thereby to extract a confession from him. Upon hearing this, I knew it would not be long until the witch doctor would insist on submitting the chief to the fearful Sasswood test. This meant he would be compelled to drink the poisoned cup. They believed an innocent person would vomit the poison and live, but somehow no one ever seemed to do so. Hoping to be able to rescue the apparently doomed king, I hurriedly made up a small party of local men and set out on foot through the tropical jungle for Carlo's village. Upon reaching the village, I approached King Carlo's compound and learned from some of his servants that he had been seized by his own family people at the instigation of the witch doctor. They had bound him with tai-tai vine and placed him in the attic-like storage space under the roof of his own large hut. A fire had been kindled in the center of the mud floor, and a large quantity of dried red peppers placed on the fire. For 3 days and nights he had been smoked with pepper fumes. In a weakened, half-dead condition, the chief had been taken down from the loft a few hours before my arrival. He was at that moment in the hands of the witch doctor, sub-chiefs, elders, and tribal warriors, who were fully convinced he was a wicked witch and responsible for all the recent deaths in the tribe. The chief had consistently maintained his innocence to no avail. He had been taken to a large grove of mango trees at the edge of the village, where court trials and cannibal feasts had taken place as long as any of them could remember. When we reached the place, we found a large crowd of excited people gathered in a great circle. Carlo's semi-conscious body was lying on the ground near the center. The witch doctor, who was one of the most grotesque creatures I ever saw, was pacing back and forth in the middle of the circle. His long mop of hair was smeared with palm oil and cow dung. His face had deep tattoo scars. A string of leopard's teeth hung about his neck, and from his waist hung pouches of juju and fetish medicine. The white tails of several bishop monkeys trailed behind him. Addressing the assembled crowd, the witch doctor was calling out the names of those who had recently died, as the result, it was believed, of an evil eye cast upon them by the chief. Near the chief I saw a pot of sasswood and knew he would be soon forced to drink the poisoned brew. What could I do at this late hour to save his life? Acting on impulse, I made my way to the center of the circle, and before anyone realized what was taking place, I stumbled, accidentally on purpose, over the pot of poison and spilled its deadly contents on the ground. My sudden appearance and its awkwardness caused no small stir among the people. I apologized for interrupting their conference by trying to explain that I had come to invite my friend, their kind and respected Chief Carlo, to accompany me to my home for an extended visit. It soon appeared that I had made a fatal mistake, for almost instantly our little company of men was completely surrounded by a solid wall of angry warriors. They were all armed with weapons, bows and arrows, long spears, cutlasses, and muzzle-loading guns. Suddenly someone shouted, "Kill the white man!" This cry was taken up by others until it became a deafening roar. They soon worked themselves into a frenzy and were quivering from head to foot with almost uncontrollable rage. It now appeared that instead of being able to save Carlo, our small group would be killed along with the chief by this angry mob. Pandemonium continued for what seemed to me like hours. They became so hoarse from shouting that some of them could hardly speak above a whisper. I was personally unarmed, although two of my porters carried guns, a shotgun and an old army rifle which we used to supply game while on trek. I had cautioned the bearers to be very careful when using the rifle. I pointed out to them that one shell was capable of killing 12 men, if all stood in a row as in the army and were hit in a vital spot. I did this to avoid anyone's using it on small game, especially near gardens and villages where someone could accidentally be killed before the bullet was spent. What changed their minds? If it were not for the seriousness of our predicament, it would have been ludicrous to see the way the gun-bearer, Sido, clung to the old army rifle. As far as he was concerned, it could have been a cannon. We realized that, barring a miracle, we would soon be killed by these angry warriors. Fervently we prayed for divine intervention. When it appeared that our cause was lost and the situation completely hopeless, there came a sudden stillness over the crowd. The witch doctor, who had been in conference with the tribal elders, had an announcement to make. They had now decided to allow us to take Carlo to our station for a visit. This sounded to us almost too good to be true. In fact, we were afraid we had misunderstood them. Still fearful they might change their minds, we hurriedly placed the helpless chief in my hammock and made our way through a gap in the otherwise solid wall of warriors and quickly left the village. What had happened? What changed their minds? It was not until we made camp that night that I learned the real reason for the sudden conciliatory attitude of these otherwise hostile people. In the midst of the deafening cries of "Kill the white man," Sido had slyly volunteered the information to one of the leading elders that one of the white man's guns was capable of killing 12 men with one shot. And in addition to the shell in the chamber, it carried 5 more in the magazine, each capable of doing the same thing. Upon hearing this, the elder called the witch doctor and some of the others aside for a consultation. They decided it might be best to call a truce. In their superstition, they apparently believed that the gun could not possibly be fired without killing at least 12 persons. Ridiculous? Of course. But God turned their superstitious beliefs to our deliverance. It took several weeks to nurse Carlo back to health. As soon as he was physically able, he attended all our daily services at the chapel and sat under the influence of the gospel. We prayed with him daily, as did our Christian workers, and it seemed he responded to the best he knew how. After he regained his strength, I called a conference in his town of sub-chiefs and elders and managed to get him reinstated as paramount chief. This position he held until his death some months later. 25 years later, I visited the tribe and found that cannibalism and the use of the poison cup had officially been abolished. Churches, schools, and medical clinics were in evidence. The influence of the gospel had wrought a tremendous change among these people since the day I rescued a king. Chapter 11. Before we kill and eat you. But when they shall lead you and deliver you up, take no thought beforehand what ye shall speak, neither do ye premeditate. But whatsoever shall be given you in that hour, that speak ye. For it is not ye that speak, but the Holy Ghost. Mark 13, verse 11. The Pond tribespeople of Liberia, among whom we were now living, had rarely seen a white person or heard the name of Jesus before our coming. We labored diligently to give them the gospel. But only a few months after our arrival among them, we were completely cut off by flooded streams and marshes. Supplies were low, and our stomachs soon rebelled against the steady diet of rice. With severe attacks of malaria fever, we both became desperately ill. I had pleaded for weeks with some of the natives to make up a caravan to go after mail and supplies for us. Finally, we managed to get a group of men who agreed to go. Ruth had been only semi-conscious for 17 days and did not even know when the carriers left at cock's crow one morning. About midday, the head carrier reappeared in our doorway. I started to rebuke him for breaking his promise when he blurted out what had happened. During a previous intertribal feud, an extra man from the nearby village of Chodai had been killed and eaten by enemies. The head carrier had unfortunately employed a young man, Kuso, from the enemy section, and he was recognized by the people in the village through which our carriers tried to pass. The warriors of that village, determined to even the score, seized Kuso and beat him severely. The other porters tried to protect him, but had to abandon him to his captors. The head carrier had returned to Rodilli to tell me what had happened. I told him to go back to the village and tell the chief to let the victim go. He said, "Not me. I barely escaped. All the porters are being held, and none dare leave the village. If you go with me, I will go, but never will I go back without you." Another rescue mission. I hated to leave Ruth in her illness, but because we needed supplies so desperately, and because the man's life was at stake, Rachel Yeda and Timothy's wife Mabel, two dedicated Christian Baroba women, said they would gladly care for Mama while I was gone. So I hurriedly made up another caravan and started out. Just before dark, we arrived at the village. All the villages were enclosed by a high wooden pole fence and usually guarded by spearmen all around. We circled around the stockade to a point as close to the prison hut as possible without being seen. I was helped over the fence by my men, whom I told to make for the hut as soon as they saw me enter it. Cautiously moving from hut to hut, I came to a wide clearing in front of the chief's court and the prison hut. The door of the prison hut was guarded by two stalwart warriors armed with spears. I must confess I was almost paralyzed with fear. Mustering all the courage I could, I headed for the door of the hut. I saluted the guards with the only greeting I knew, "Tato, Tato," and cut the grass rope holding the little bamboo mat door in place. I entered the hut and felt my way in the darkness. I found the badly beaten Kuso tied to the center pole. At once he begged, "Please, white man, save me." I answered, "Well, I'm going to try." I cut his cords and dragged him out the door. By this time, the two guards had spread the alarm, and a large crowd of screaming, yelling people was gathering in the courtyard. My men now joined me, and I sat down from near exhaustion on an old elephant skull. I thought the infuriated natives would tear me apart. We were completely surrounded by this angry, yelling, bloodthirsty mob. I sat there and prayed, realizing that at any moment the end might come. I knew only a few words in their language, but I recognized enough to conclude that they intended to kill me, along with the man I was trying to rescue. The confusion lasted for what seemed hours to me. Finally, the people sat down in a great circle, and the crowd ceased yelling. The witch doctor rose from his place to present his case for prosecution. His hair was braided and plastered down with cow dung and palm oil. His face was scarred with tribal markings. His teeth were ugly and gnarled. Around his neck was a string of leopard's teeth, and from his neck, waist, and shoulders hung pouches of juju and fetish medicine. I have seldom seen a more evil-looking person. He would lunge at me, making grotesque grimaces, and then draw back amid the cheers of the onlookers. It seemed he was trying to scare me to death, and he almost did just that. I could feel the powers of darkness so strongly about me that it seemed I could have cut them with a knife. With a grass wand in his hand and walking back and forth, the witch doctor started a long, emotional harangue. I followed it only by snatches and by deduction. He related the long, warring history of his people up to that night. He told how they had now gotten even by capturing the warrior they were about to feast on. The white man had rudely interrupted their festivities. Now, he asked, "What shall we do with this white man who has dared to upset our plan?" All replied in one voice, "We shall kill and eat him too." The Spirit of the Lord upon me. Then the witch doctor came to where I was and laid the wand on the ground at my feet, indicating I was now permitted to speak in my own defense. As plainly as if he had spoken in perfect English, he was saying with contempt, "Before we kill and eat you, let's hear what you have to say." I was on the spot. Although I could understand a good deal of what I heard, I could not speak the language. My African preacher from Baroba knew little more than I did. We both earnestly prayed that God would show us what to do. I feared to depend on uncertain interpretation with our lives at stake. Suddenly I began to shake. This disturbed me, as I did not want the people to know how frightened I really was. Then I realized the Holy Spirit had come upon me, and the words of Jesus in Mark 13:11 came to me. "Take no thought beforehand what ye shall speak, but whatsoever shall be given you in that hour, that speak ye, for it is not ye that speak, but the Holy Ghost." Now, under the anointing of the Spirit, I stood up. I reached down and picked up the witch doctor's wand, which he had laid at my feet. I opened my mouth and began by saying, "Nile," meaning listen to me, and then it happened. The Holy Spirit took complete control of my tongue and vocal organs, and there poured from my lips a torrent of words that I had never learned. I did not know what I said, nor how long I spoke, but when I had finished, silence reigned. The witch doctor spoke privately to one of his men, who left to return soon with a white rooster. The witch doctor wrung its head off and came to me, sprinkling some of its blood on my forehead and on the wounded man Kuso by my side. He placed some of the blood on his own head and on the forehead of the cannibal chief. His actions told me the situation required blood to be shed, so the blood of the white fowl had been substituted for ours. About midnight the trial ended with the witch doctor, the chief, and the village elders pleading, "Please do not harm us. We see that your God has power and fights for you. What can we do to atone for mistreating you?" By using the few words of the Pan language known among my carriers, and through John Yeda's ability to communicate with a fascinating sign language he had acquired, we managed to make our request known. I asked them to carry Kuso back to our station and feed our other carriers before they continued on to the coast. This they hurriedly agreed to do. Soon all the porters were eating heartily. I returned to Rodilly that night with Kuso in a hammock. After a few days at our station he had recovered, and we sent him back to his village, where he witnessed strongly to his people about what great things the Lord had done for him. 25 years later, it was my privilege to revisit that part of the country. The old original village had long since been destroyed, but one night nearby, in another village where I was preaching, a middle-aged man came running up to me, calling out, "Kuikali! Kuikali!" I asked him how he knew me. He said, "How can I ever forget you? You saved my life." I then recognized that he was Kuso, and he related in detail the miraculous story of his deliverance. We rejoiced together over the thrill of seeing each other again after so many years. I am happy to say that today there are Spirit-filled pastors and churches throughout the tribe. Chapter 12. Have faith in God. And Jesus answering saith unto them, Have faith in God, for verily I say unto you, that whosoever shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that these things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith. Mark 11, verses 22 and 23. After living in Pond Territory for almost a year, we had been through repeated attacks of fever as well as near starvation for lack of proper food. Ruth was reduced to a mere skeleton. As soon as I felt she could stand the ordeal of the long hammock trip, we left Rodelli with a small caravan and headed for Baroba, not knowing whether or not she would live to make the journey. We were torn between feelings of victory and feelings of failure. We rejoiced over the many miracles God had done, but our hearts were heavy at the thought of leaving behind so much that was still undone. Looking back on the decision, I think the determining factor was our simple, practical conviction that we would be more useful to God alive than dead. Missionary deaths do accomplish much, both in testimony and in example. But missionary lives accomplish something too, and God's leading for us at that time and place was to serve by living. He blessed our 9-day journey, and we both made it to Gropaka Mission. Ruth appeared to be improving after a short stay there, but I felt her health would be much better if we were living near the coast instead of in the interior. Also, there was a great need for missionaries to work among the coastal tribes. So we made the long trek from Gropaka to the coast, then went up the coast by boat to Sinoway at the mouth of the Sinoway River. We decided to locate at Tuplutown, about 15 miles inland on the Sinoway River, and built a temporary mud and thatch house. Little Jitue, now called Ruthie, made the trip with us and continued to live with us as a daughter. However, Ruth grew steadily worse. She had reached the point where she could eat hardly anything at all. The mainstay of our diet was rice, with very little to go with it except palm butter, and she was getting almost no nourishment because the rice would not digest. I realized that in order to save her life, she would have to leave the malaria-ridden country as soon as possible. On her way to Africa, Ruth's boat had stopped at Tenerife in the Canary Islands, where she met a lovely missionary family. We had their address, so I wrote them that she would be coming on the next ship north. I felt sure they would meet her and help her find a place to stay until I could join her a few weeks later. I needed to stay in Sinoway until Ruth's brother Alfred Trotter arrived to take over the work. My sister Blanche had since returned to the States, where she and Alfred Trotter were married. I would also arrange for little Ruthie to be cared for until the Trotters arrived. Neither Ruth nor I felt at all good about being separated, especially as it was impossible to know how soon and under what circumstances we would be together again. There were so many uncertainties. Would the Trotters arrive when we expected? Would I be able to get passage for myself to the Canary Islands when I needed it? Would the missionaries I had written be able to meet Ruth and care for her? The lack of communication over the next long weeks were to be agonizing for both of us. Here is Ruth's part of the story as she tells it herself. Ruth's story. When it seemed there was no prospect of my getting better, Henry made arrangements with a Dutch shipping agent for my passage to the Canary Islands. As there was no regular schedule of service, the agent said that when the next northbound ship came in, he would have the captain blow the whistle so we would know it was in port. A few days later, as I lay in bed wondering what the future held for us, I heard the whistle. In about 2 hours, we were getting into a gig, a deep-bottomed rowboat used to carry cargo up the river. There were Henry and I and little Ruthie and some of the mission boys to row the boat. On reaching the agent's house at Sinoway, we learned it would be a little while before we would be taken out to the Dutch freighter, so we sat in the house visiting. Ruthie was free to run and play, and she enjoyed looking at the river and the ocean. Later, when boarding time drew near, I sent the boys to find her, but they returned to say she was nowhere to be found. I did so much want to see her and give her a final farewell hug, but the time came when I just had to get into the surf boat to be taken out to the ship and anchored some distance from shore. Henry accompanied me in the surf boat. Gliding down the last bit of river into the open sea in the surf boat, I heard a screeching cry. I turned to see Ruthie running along the sandy beach at the river's edge, throwing her arms up and down and screaming, "Ma, ma, ma, wee, mama, way, ee!" It was a long, sobbing wail. The tears rolled down my face as I waved and waved my hand to her in farewell. She finally stopped running where the river joined the sea and waved to us as long as we could distinguish her childish figure, and I wondered when I would ever see our little African daughter again. When we reached the ship, I was lifted to the deck in a mammy chair after a tearful farewell to Henry. Soon the ship was headed north. The Dutch captain was exceedingly kind to me and saw to my comfort. He provided his own deck chair and cushions on the choice spot on the upper deck, so I could get the prevailing sea breezes in that tropical climate. After about a week, we landed on the island of Gran Canary, where I had to transfer to a night boat to reach the island of Tenerife. The islands had been colonized by Spain, so Spanish was the main language, and unfortunately I knew no Spanish. But with the help of a cab driver who spoke a little English, I got my supper in a small restaurant, amid the unbelieving stares of everybody within sight of me. I later learned that no decent, respectable Spanish woman was ever seen in public without a male escort. Had I realized their attitude, I would have asked the cab driver to eat with me. I was thin as a rail and as white as chalk, but I think my very helplessness was my best defense. I couldn't read the menu as it was in Spanish, so the waiter just brought me a plate of food, and it was good. At last, something to eat besides rice. The ride on the night boat was uneventful, and I was looking forward to meeting my American missionary friends in the morning. The boat was to dock at 6 o'clock, so I was up early and on deck with my luggage, but I searched in vain for a familiar face on the pier. Still hoping my friends would come, I waited until I was the last passenger left on the deck. What in the world was I to do? But I had to get off the boat, so I started down the gangway. Just then a friendly cab driver came up to me and said, "May I help you?" I told him the name of the people I wanted to see and gave him their address. He drove me to what he thought was the district where they lived, but these missionaries were unknown. I suggested he take me to the American consul. He exclaimed, "At 6 o'clock on Sunday morning? No, I'll take care of you." He put me in a hotel lobby and told me to stay there until he returned. In half an hour he appeared in the lobby to say he had found the place I was looking for, so I again got into his horse-drawn cab. Soon he stopped in front of a brick wall with an arched gateway and clapped his hands. A young Spanish woman named Eloisa answered his call and opened the gate. Chapter 13. Jitwe Revisited. I thank God that without ceasing I have remembrance of thee in my prayers night and day, greatly desiring to see thee, being mindful of the tears that I may be filled with joy. 2 Timothy 1, verses 3 and 4. In 1945, while serving as Africa Field Secretary for the Assemblies of God, I made one of many trips to Africa to survey the work in some of the countries where we had missionaries. This time Ruth was with me, and we hoped it would be possible to visit our African daughter Ruth, formerly Jitwe, during the trip. But we could not make definite plans in advance. In spite of the innovations made in modes of transportation over the years, travel in Liberia was still very primitive. We had been out of contact with Ruth for some years. In 1923, when I left the last station we had worked on in Liberia, Sinué, I had left her with a nearby mission until my sister Blanche and her husband Alfred Trotter arrived. They then cared for her during the time they spent in Liberia. When the Trotters had to leave the field because of Blanche's health, they asked some Methodist missionaries, Mr. and Mrs. Walter Williams, to take Ruth into their mission school so she could complete her education. They gladly welcomed the little Crew girl. The Williams station was at Nana Crew, the area where Ruth had been born to Jetu. Alfred took her to Nana Crew and explained to the Williamses how I had rescued the little girl and returned her to her mother, a Crew woman from the coast, and then had kept her upon her mother's death. A native preacher by the name of Amos Rubu, on hearing this story and seeing the girl, cried out, "This is my long-lost daughter." He then told the same story that Jetu had first told us about the kidnapping and the murder of her son by witch doctors. He said Jetu had taken their daughter and run away, and he had heard nothing from her since that time. Rubu gathered the little girl in his arms and pointed to the tribal markings he had put on her forehead when she was a baby. There was great rejoicing at the mission at this reunion of father and daughter. Little Ruth stayed with the Williamses at the mission school until they left for furlough, then went to live with her father. News from our daughter. Some years later, while pastoring in Kansas City, Kansas, we received a heartbreaking letter from Ruth, forwarded from missionaries in Gold Coast. She had somehow gotten our address in Gold Coast, but the letter came after we had returned to the States. In the letter she explained that she had written to us, her Christian parents, many times, but had never received a reply. None of her letters had reached us prior to this. She told us of her marriage to a Methodist pastor, Benjamin Swain, and of the birth of her 4 children, one of whom had died. Her son had been named after me. She also said her father had died, and of course she barely remembered her natural mother, so she felt we were all she had left for a family. She closed by saying, "I beg you all send me your comfort words from your mouth." We were very touched by her letter and felt so badly that her earlier letters had failed to reach us. We had not tried to keep in touch with her, as we feared this would divide her loyalty to the Williamses at the Methodist Mission, who were caring for her and continuing her education. And we had received no word that she had gone to live with her father. On receiving this word from her, however, we wrote her immediately and assured her of our interest and prayers for her. From that time on, we corresponded with her as regularly as possible. We occasionally sent gifts for her and her children, as well as teaching aids for them to use in their church. We wrote Ruth that we expected to be in Africa in late 1945 or early 1946, but were not at all certain whether we would be able to visit her town. We reached Liberia in December 1945 to visit several stations and to attend the annual missionary convention. While at the convention, a young native came to the guest house where we were staying to ask if we knew Ruth Swain. We replied, "Yes, we do." Smiling broadly, he told us he was from her town, Barclayville, and that he would be happy to carry a letter from us to her. We wrote her that we would do our best to visit her in early February 1946. Following the convention, I went on a long trek into the interior to visit several remote stations, and Mrs. Garlock went with 2 other lady missionaries to spend some time at the station in Newaka, where I had attended my first convention. For the trip to Newaka, one of Mrs. Garlock's hammock men was a son of Gredigi in Gropaka. Gredigi had been one of her carriers on her first trip to the interior in 1921. Journey to Barclayville. I rejoined Mrs. Garlock in Newaka on January 22nd, and a few days later we started out for Cape Palmas. From there we had to go 50 miles up the Atlantic coast to a town called Piccaninny Cess, and then 10 miles interior to Barclayville. We had hoped to make the trip up the coast by plane, but found that plane service had been discontinued. The only way left was to get a surf boat to take us to Piccaninny Cess, which was difficult to do. We finally found a headman with a boat and crew who said he would take us, leaving Cape Palmas at 2 p.m. January 28. When we came back at the appointed hour, the headman was nowhere to be found. We looked him up and asked why the delay. He said, "The breeze, he no proper yet." But he expected the right breeze to come up at any time, and would let us know when he was ready to start out. The boatmen were not keen on pulling on the oars after hour, and were hoping for a good breeze so they could put up a sail and quickly carry us along the coast. We finally went to bed fully clothed in order to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. At 4 the next morning, the head man came and told us, "The breeze, he proper now." They called it plopla. We got into the boat with our baggage and gear along with the 4 mission boys who had come along to help us carry the loads. In addition to our personal baggage, we had to carry with us a folding camp bed and mattress roll, mosquito net, a hammock and its bamboo pole, water canteens, kerosene lanterns, wash basin, a box of groceries, eating utensils, sun umbrella, etc. It took over 8 hours to travel 30 miles up the coast to Garaway, the station where we were married in 1921. We stopped there to rest, as it had been a very tiring trip. At 9 p.m. we boarded the boat again for the rest of the journey to Piccaninny Cess. Whenever the breeze quit, the men had to take to the oars, but time meant nothing to them. If you didn't get there today, well, there was tomorrow, or the next day. Why in the world is the white man in a hurry? We reached Piccaninny Cess 12 hours later at 9 a.m. January 30th. After we had our gear unloaded from the boat, we had a palaver with the boatmen. They wanted to leave again right away to return to Cape Palmas. We explained we wanted to visit 10 miles interior overnight and return to Cape Palmas the next day. It took some time to talk the palaver and convince them to wait until the next day to take us back to the Cape. Then there was a palaver to get hammock men from Pickaninny Cess to help us with the 10-mile trek. We were only able to get 2 carriers to carry a hammock for Mrs. Garlock, which meant I had to walk all the way. The 4 mission boys also went along to help carry our gear. We had never been to Barclayville and had no idea what to expect. The 2 hammock men were quite puzzled as to why we were going to Barclayville. They kept telling us again and again that there were no white people in Barclayville, the mission station was empty, and no African government official lived there. Therefore, there was nobody there for us to see. We kept insisting we were going to see a black African family, but that was more than they could comprehend. The village of Barclayville was not a compact little town. It was bush country, and each little house or group of houses was by itself, completely surrounded by forest and bush. Christian houses were distinguishable from the ordinary round mud huts, as the Christians had taken to building rectangular houses with 2 or more rooms, but also made of mud and thatch. The trail led into a small clearing where there were 2 Christian houses. Near the door of one, a group of teenage girls was talking. We turned toward them and asked if they knew where Ruth Swain lived. They gave us directions with broad smiles and sparkling enthusiasm, and I knew they were expecting us. So we jogged on. Mrs. Garlock was carried in the hammock. I went behind them with my 5-foot walking staff, and behind me were the 4 boys with loads on their heads. The reunion. A short distance further down the trail we caught sight of a Christian home. In the yard stood a woman leaning over a tub sorting clothes. My wife recognized that it was Ruth and called to the hammock men to stop and let her out of the hammock. They insisted they should take her on up the hill to the mission house, and we had to persuade them to stop. Ruth had seen us from her yard and started on the run for the path where we were. She reached me first while Mrs. Garlock was getting out of the hammock to come back where I had stopped on the path. Ruth did not say a word, just grabbed me around the waist and hung on. I am sure it was a startling sight to the carriers to see me, a white man, 6 feet tall, being hugged by this short, plump little African woman. Then she let go of me and threw her arms around Mrs. Garlock, the tears flowing freely. As I looked at her beaming face, I remembered that night so many years ago when God had enabled us to rescue her from slavery and bring her to the bedside of her dying mother. The emotions we felt at that moment are impossible to describe. After a few moments, we all relaxed and walked toward the house. At first, Ruth could scarcely talk, but after reaching the house, we sat down on some benches under the wide overhanging eaves and began to share what had happened in the years since we had last seen her. She could hardly believe we were real. She kept her hand on Mrs. Garlock for hours as if she were fearful she would disappear if she let go of her. As soon as we sat down, her 3 children snuggled up as close to us as they could. She evidently told them a great deal about us. Unfortunately, her husband Benjamin was attending a church conference in a distant town, so we missed seeing him. We sat and talked for hours. During the afternoon, 2 of the Christian girls we had seen as we came into Barclayville came to the house, and without a word or sign from Ruth began to prepare the dinner of palm butter and rice. Toward sunset, Ruth and her children walked with us up the steep hill to the abandoned mission station. There is something tragic about an abandoned mission station. We could see scores of mud channels of the termites over the stone foundation and into the walls. Once a building is abandoned, the termites quickly take over, as they had here. On our way back to the house, we stopped to rest at a grove of coffee trees which were in bloom. The scent filled the air, and it reminded me of the scent of orange blossoms. On reaching the house, we found our baggage had been carried into a large room in Ruth's house. An 18-inch shelf about 4 feet off the floor went around 2 sides of the room and was covered with a clean white cloth. In one corner stood a double bed with a mosquito net hanging from the overhead frame. I just presumed that this was where we were to stay. In a few minutes, the girls announced that chop was ready. We went into the dining room where we found a large table set with plates and spoons. The table and chairs were native-made and quite sturdy. Ruth told us to sit down and eat, but we insisted that she and the children eat with us. They were pleased with the idea, and the girls beamed proudly as they served us. In the palm butter was chicken, sweet potatoes, and palm cabbage. It had been 23 years since we had eaten palm chop, so it was really a treat. Ruth had evidently warned the girls to go easy on the red pepper. It tasted just right without blistering our tongues. We talked until 9 that evening. Our boys had put up the double camp cot in the large room where our baggage had been placed. When we were preparing to retire, Ruth came into the room several times, said nothing, hesitated a bit, then walked out. Finally, Mrs. Garlock said, "Ruth, what is the matter?" She hesitated a moment and then said, "Mama, it's a long time since I slept in the same room with you and—" My wife answered quickly, "Ruth, if you want to sleep in here too, that is just fine with us. You do as you want to do." She nodded and smiled and left the room. We don't know how she managed it, but after we were in bed and our lantern out, she got the children in bed with her there in the same room without making a sound. We awoke the next morning at 5 and found Ruth and the children all up. They were not only dressed, but dressed up as if for some special occasion. I asked the reason for their being dressed, and she said, "Oh, we're going down to the beach with you." Our boys helped us get our things packed up, and we were ready to leave about 6 a.m. Ruth tied 2-year-old Helen on her back, and with 5.5-year-old Henry and 8-year-old Nancy followed us out on the trail for the 10-mile trek. They had to almost run to keep up with the men who were carrying the hammock, but Ruth wanted to stay alongside the hammock near Mrs. Garlock. Finally, we convinced her to drop back and walk with me at a more leisurely pace. Farewell once again. We reached the beach about 8:30 a.m. and began to round up the boatmen and get our things aboard. We found the boat already loaded with some cargo, bundles of piassava fiber, large sacks of palm kernels, coffee beans, cocoa beans, and dried coconut. There was also a black woman passenger. After a tearful farewell to Ruth and the children, we stepped into the boat. We sat at the rear of the boat looking toward the shore as the boat headed straight out from the beach in order to get around a rocky jetty. Mrs. Garlock was almost face to face with the boatman taking care of the rudder. The tears were running down her face while she was constantly waving to Ruth and her children standing on the shore who were waving back at us. The man at the rudder told the others on board that she was crying. As she started to raise her other hand to continue waving, the face of the black woman passenger came up under her arm, and she looked straight into my wife's face to see if she really was crying. The whole experience was mystifying to these Africans. That was the last time we saw Ruth. It reminded us of the first time we had left her standing on the beach crying, "Mama, way!" And now, 23 years later, we were waving and crying again, only this time she was silent. When we arrived in Cape Palmas, we stayed there for a few days in a mission house while awaiting a military plane on which we could ride up to Monrovia to continue our journey. One day, a stranger knocked on the door and asked to see Pa Garlock. It was Benjamin, Ruth's husband. He told us he had gotten home late in the afternoon of the day we left. He said he found Ruth lying on the bed crying because, "When my mama died, God gave me another mama, but after a while she went off and left me. Yesterday she came to see me again, and now she has left me again." When Benjamin heard that, he felt he just had to make the long trip to come and see us, as we had never met before. Since then, we have kept in touch by mail. Through the years, Ruth and Benjamin have pastored a number of churches in the area of the Kru tribe on the Liberian coast. Recently, Ruth wrote that because of Benjamin's long treks through the jungles when he served many years as district superintendent, his legs have failed him and he's not able to walk very much or to stand in the pulpit to preach. Ruth frequently carries on in his place. The Methodist bishop, recognizing her ability and godly character and faithfulness, has fully ordained her to the gospel ministry. A few years ago, her older daughter died and left 5 children, whom Ruth has now taken in her own care. She now is raising a second family. We were able to have a hand sewing machine delivered to her so she can make clothing for the children. We marvel at the goodness of God and his infinite wisdom in planning a multitude of details that in the aggregate fulfilled his glorious purpose in the lives of so many people. Whatever risks were involved in rescuing Ruth from cannibals in 1922, the results were certainly well worth it. Chapter 14. The Return of Kwikali. So then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 7. Late in 1945, while serving as field secretary for Africa for the Assemblies of God, Ruth and I revisited Liberia in time for the annual Christmas convention. This was exactly 25 years after my sister Blanche and I attended our first convention there in 1920. There were 14 people present in 1945 who had attended that convention 25 years before. Although our first missions aircraft had arrived in Liberia a few months earlier, there were no airstrips in the interior large enough to accommodate the plane. So leaving Ruth at Niwaka, which is now the site of New Hope leper colony, I set out on foot to visit all our mission stations in the interior, accompanied by porters who transported my small traveling kit by headloads. After an absence of more than 20 years, the old trails seemed much more difficult than they had been 2 decades earlier. Arriving one evening at an interior village on the summit of a rather high hill, I sat down to rest on the thatched-roofed veranda of the headman's hut. I was exhausted, but I really felt like singing Balaam's song. Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my last end be like his. Numbers 23, verse 10. In a short time, the village headman arrived home from his rice farm with a native hoe on his shoulder. He looked me over and asked if I were tired. I replied that I was very tired, as the day had been very hot, and the trails had seemed unusually long. After offering me a drink of water, he proceeded to tell me that white people are not as strong as black people. He said that when his wife gave birth to a child, the palms of its hands and the soles of his feet were white. But after the child grew, these turned darker, and it became very strong. After a bit of talk about the congenital weakness of white, he commented that he had known only one exception, the first white man who had come to his country, the first missionary to bring the gospel to his people, the first white man he had ever seen. This white man was different from others, he said. When I asked him how this white man was different, he went on to describe what sounded like a legendary person. This white man was very tall and very strong, a sort of Herculean giant. He seemed never to get tired. He could outwalk any black man in the country. He never used a hammock, as most white people do these days. He would many times travel a 2-day journey in one day. He was a mighty hunter. When he shot at an animal, he never missed, and he often killed 2 animals with one shot. He wore the first clothing that any of them had ever seen, and he was the first one to tell them the story of Jesus. I let him talk on for a while, and then I asked him the name of this fabulous creature. He said, "We called him Kwee-Kali. We named him after the white bird in our country." I asked him where this strange white man was now. He said, "Oh, he must have died many years ago. We haven't seen or heard of him in a long time. He came here when I was a young man, and now I am getting old." Finally, I could wait no longer, so I asked, "Who do you think I am?" He looked at me intently, and when he noticed the look of amusement on my face, he suddenly exclaimed, "I think you're Kwee-Kali." When my porters confirmed my identity, there was quite a celebration in town. He threw his arms about me and almost squeezed the life out of me as he cried, "Kwee-Kali! Kwee-Kali!" Then he danced about and called his family and the townspeople together. "Our father has returned to us. He has come home. This is Kwee-Kali. Kwee-Kali is home." Further conversation revealed that he had lived in a small village near Rodilly, where we had first located, and had heard me preach several times. He also had visited us at the pond station on one occasion. So he had gotten to know us. After we had left Liberia, his village had been destroyed in an intertribal war, and he had resettled as chief in this village where we had just met again. During a service we held that evening, we learned there was a thriving group of Christians in the village. One sows, another reaps, and God gives the increase. I was home, but I could not stay. 100 duties in a score of places called me on. I have had many homes in Africa, yet I was always a pilgrim starting in a new place. Many missionaries have poured their efforts into Africa and other lands since first I became a missionary. Much has changed, of course, and most of it for the better. Cannibalism, for example, was a traditional way of life for many tribes in 1920. Today it survives only in super-secret, superstitious rituals. In looking back, I have sometimes felt that some of the missionary methods we used to employ seem as primitive as the people among whom we used them. But they started something, and in some of the places where I saw only limited results, later workers have reaped a harvest. I am thankful. And I am encouraged to know that for some of those missionaries, Ruth and I helped open up the road. There is still something satisfying in being a pioneer. The book closes with a poem entitled "O Pioneers" by V. Helen Friedlander. We shall not travel by the road we make, ere day by day the sound of many feet is heard upon the stones that now we break. We shall be come to where the crossroads meet. For us the heat by day, the cold by night, the inch slow progress and the heavy load, and death at last to close the long grim fight with man and beast and stone. For them the road. For them the shade of trees that now we plant, the safe, smooth journey and the final goal. Yea, birthright in the land of covenant. For us, day labor and travail of soul. And yet the road is ours as never theirs. Is not one thing on us alone bestowed? For us the master joy, O pioneers. We shall not travel, but we make the road. This is the end of the book, Before We Kill and Eat You, by H.B. Garlock.
We hope you enjoyed this audiobook. Tape Ministries Northwest is a free lending library. However, we do depend on the private sector for our financial support, with gifts from individuals, churches, foundations, and businesses. Please prayerfully consider sending a financial gift to Tape Ministries Northwest. You may send a one-time gift, include us in your monthly charitable giving plan, include us in your will, or honor a loved one through a memorial or tribute gift. Your gift is tax-deductible. Please return this book to Tape Ministries Northwest. Turn over the address card found on the outside of the book container. If the hole punched is in the lower right-hand corner, our correct address is printed on this side. Insert this card back into the container and put in the mail to be returned to us.